History of the Donatists.
The origin of the Christian religion in Africa. Persecutions of Christians. The persecution of Diocletian. The handing over of sacred books. Africa did not receive Christianity directly from the apostles, but likely received the first seeds of the gospel from the Romans after a century had already passed. These seeds gradually grew and soon produced a large harvest, even though persecutions occasionally cut down part of it. Yet from the very torments and killings, it gained strength. Tertullian aptly said, "On behalf of the Christians in Africa to the pagans, we become more numerous every time we are mowed down by you. The blood of Christians is seed." However, the most severe persecution against Christians in Africa occurred during the reign of Diocletian and Maximian, after edicts against Christians were issued worldwide at the beginning of the year 303. In the proconsular province, Annulinus, and in Numidia, Florus, waged war against Christians. Optatus describes this in Book 3, Section 8. Everyone knows what their crafty cruelty achieved. A war was declared against Christians. In the temples of demons, the devil triumphed. The altars smoked with impure fumes, and because they could not come to sacrileges, they were forced to place incense wherever they could. Every place was a temple for crime. The old were defiled near death. Childhood was polluted in ignorance. Infants were carried to evil deeds by their mothers. Parents were forced to commit bloodless parricides. Some were forced to overturn the temples of the living God, others to deny Christ, others to burn the divine laws, others to place incense. And the same author in Book 1, Section 13. The storm of this persecution spread throughout all of Africa, making some martyrs, others confessors, and laying some low in a disastrous death, while leaving those who hid unharmed. Why should I mention the lay people, who then had no dignity in the church? What about the many ministers? What about the deacons in the third rank? What about the presbyters in the second priesthood? The leaders and chiefs of all, including some bishops at that time, to avoid eternal damnation and extend their short, uncertain lives, impiously handed over the instruments of divine law. This was a peculiar evil of Diocletian's persecution, where Christians were forced to surrender their sacred books to be burned. Cunning men believed that the Christian religion could be erased from people's minds if the books containing Christian teachings were removed. Hence, Diocletian and Maximian's edict specifically ordered that sacred books be destroyed by fire. To enforce this, it was assigned to leaders and magistrates in each place to seize the holy books from bishops and priests, as recounted in the Acts of Felix, Bishop of Thubarbo. According to this edict, magistrates in each region ordered readers, priests and bishops to appear before them, demanding the scriptures from them. Those who refused to hand them over were tortured and imprisoned. Those who persisted were sent to the proconsul or another higher magistrate and were sentenced to death. Officials and soldiers searched Christians' homes, looking through the most secret areas, not only confiscating sacred books but also gold and silver sacred vessels, chalices, lamps, and other ornaments. They even took clothes prepared for the poor. Eventually, as often happens in such cases, the most unscrupulous people looted both sacred and secular valuables. In Africa, old records, which we attach to Optatus's books, confirm the ferocity of the persecutors' rage. Sadly, we also learn from these records, as Optatus says, that many Christians, not only lay people but also clerics and even bishops, out of fear of torture and death, handed over sacred books and other holy vessels or instruments. These people were commonly called traditores. Some people, on the other hand, were excessively passionate. Even if no one asked, they declared they had sacred books which they refused to hand over, exposing themselves to death. Those who kept the sacred books hidden in silence were much more prudent and religious. When apprehended and questioned, they neither handed them over nor claimed they would. Menshurius of Carthage on the handing over of sacred books. What Secundus of Tixus, primate of Numidia, thought among them was Menshurius of Carthage, a bishop who, following the teachings of his predecessor Cyprian, disapproved of those who, without being apprehended, offered themselves to the persecutors. They declared they had scriptures which they would not hand over, even though no one had asked them. He forbade these people to be honored as martyrs. He himself testified in a letter to Secundus that he had taken and kept the sacred books so they wouldn't be found by the persecutors, and had left writings of heretics in the basilica instead. When the persecutors found and took these, nothing more was demanded. Although some later suggested to the proconsul that those sent to seize and burn the Christian scriptures had been deceived because they found only irrelevant writings, and that the actual scriptures were kept in the bishop's house and should be brought out and burned, the proconsul refused to agree to this. Thus, through Menshurius's prudence, the principal sacred books were preserved in Carthage. Secundus of Tixus, primate of Numidia, boasted in words, deceiving those ignorant of the facts, but lacking virtue. He was laughed at by those who knew what he had done. He wrote letters to Menshurius, saying that messengers had been sent to him by the curator and the order of a centurion and a beneficiary. Asking for the divine books to be burned, he responded, "I am a Christian and a bishop, not a traitor." And when they wanted to take something from him, whether it was a letter or anything else, he refused to give it to them, following the example of Eleazar the Maccabean, who did not want to pretend to eat pork to avoid setting a bad example of breaking the law. But Purpurius, the bishop of Limatensis, a man of shameless arrogance, silenced Secundus' boast with this reproach, saying, when accused by him of murder, with these mocking words, "What did you do when you were held by the curator and the council to hand over the scriptures? How did you free yourself from them, unless you gave or ordered something to be given? They wouldn't have let you go otherwise." This insult repressed Secundus' boldness. From being an accuser, he became an accused, fearing for himself as he was aware of his own betrayal. He handed the whole matter over to God's judgment, and allowed his fellow bishops, clearly convicted of betrayal by their own confession, to be free from all punishment, lest he himself be prosecuted for the same crime. The sacred books handed over by Paul of Cirta and Silvanus. Paul was the bishop of the city of Cirta, the capital of the civil province of Numidia. On May 19, Munatius Felix, the perpetual priest and curator of the colony of Cirta, came to him and demanded that the bishop produce the scriptures of the law and anything else he might have. He replied that the scriptures were with the readers. As for what he had, he was ready to give it. When asked again to show the readers or send for them, he replied that they were known to Odysseus and Junius the recorders. Then Paul and his clerics handed over the cups, lamps, clothes of the poor, and all the church's furniture, as well as one book to the investigators. From there, the magistrates went to the houses of the readers, who, without much resistance, handed over the sacred books. In particular, Silvanus, then a subdeacon, voluntarily brought out a lamp and a silver book cover that were hidden, saying he found them behind a chest. Christians in the city of Abatina were arrested and thrown into prison. Today we'll talk about Caecilian and Mansurius's cautious visits to the martyrs. During the persecution on February 12, 304, in Abatina, Saturnus the presbyter and his 4 children, Saturninus, Felix, Maria, and Hilarion, along with Dativus, Felix, Ampelius, and many others, were celebrating the Lord's sacraments. They were arrested by the local magistrates and taken to Carthage. After a courageous confession, they were thrown into prison. Unsurprisingly, Christians flocked to visit them, causing crowds that stirred up envy and exposed more people to danger. Seeing this, Mansurius instructed Caecilian, the archdeacon, to keep the imprudent crowd away from the prison, to avoid disturbances and envy. Later, Caecilian's adversaries falsely accused him of placing armed men at the prison doors and harshly driving away those bringing food and drink to the martyrs. This accusation is highly implausible, and seems to stem from Cyprian's advice to visit and care for the confessors cautiously and not in crowds. Cyprian recommended in his letter that presbyters should take turns visiting, ensuring order, peace, and care for the people. Now, let's discuss the case of Felix of Aptunga. Felix, who ordained Caecilian, was accused by the Donatists of handing over sacred texts. However, testimonies from an inquiry in 314 by the proconsul Ilanus, ordered by Emperor Constantine, found Felix innocent of this crime. Caecilianus, who was the duumvir of the Aptungatana colony, testified that when a decree was issued to destroy churches and burn Christian books, he was in Zama. When some Christians asked if the sacred order had reached him, he replied that it had not yet, but he had seen copies of it, and witnessed churches and scriptures being destroyed in Zama and Firmis. He then asked them to bring any scriptures they had. They sent them to Felix's house, and Galatius, where Christian prayers were usually held, went and took the chair and greeting letters and burned all the doors. When public officials were sent to Bishop Felix's house, they reported that he was absent. Thus, according to this testimony, nothing was found to have been handed over by Felix. However, Ingentius, who later became a decurion of the Zequensians, and was angry with Felix for excommunicating his friend and guest, Maurus, the bishop of Utica, approached Caecilianus and asked him in Felix's name to testify in writing that the sacred books had been burnt during his term as duumvir. When Caecilianus refused, Augentius, a friend and colleague of Caecilianus, interceded. At his request, Caecilianus wrote a letter to Felix, testifying that during his term as duumvir, and in the presence of Galatius, some greeting letters had been taken from the basilica. Ingentius added to this letter that Felix had said, "Take the key, and those books on the chair and on the stone, take them, but ensure the officials do not take the oil and wheat." When Caecilianus replied, "Do you not know that where scriptures are found, the house itself is destroyed?" Felix responded, "Then what shall we do?" Caecilian responded, "Let someone from your side take it to the area where you make your prayers, place it there, and I will come with the officials and take it." Felix complied with this advice, ordering the sacred text to be placed in the area. Caecilian came with the officials and took everything according to the sacred command. Caecilian argued in court that this whole matter was added to his letter, and accused Ingentius of lying. Ingentius, fearing impending torture, confessed that he had added these things to the letter to avenge his host Maurus by branding Felix as a traitor. Names of the bishops of the Council of Cirta. With the persecution of handing over the codices slightly easing in the year 305 CE, On March 5, 10 or 11 bishops of Numidia convened at Cirta in the house of Urbanus Donatus, to ordain a bishop to replace Paulus of Cirta. First among them by seniority was Secundus of Tigcis, with Donatus of Mascula, Victor of Rusicod, Marinus from Aquae Tibilitini, Donatus of Calama, Purpurius of Lamisa, Victor of Garba, Felix from Rotarium, Nabor from Centurions, and Secundus the Younger, son of the brother of Secundus of Tigcis. Manalius also came to Cirta, an uncertain bishop from Numidia, but to avoid being proven to have offered incense by his fellow citizens, he pretended to have eye pain and hesitated to approach his colleagues. Several were accused of betrayal by Secundus. Purpurius, accused of homicide, responded fiercely. All were acquitted, leaving their cause to God. In the council, Secundus proposed that before ordaining a bishop, they should prove themselves by clearing any accusations or suspicions of crimes. Then he asked Donatus of Mascula if he had handed over the scriptures. Donatus neither confessed openly nor denied outright, but replied that Florus had asked him to offer incense and that nothing had been handed over to him. He added, "Because God has forgiven me, you should also spare me for God's sake," thus seeking pardon for a crime he seemingly admitted to. Secundus replied, "What then shall we do about the martyrs who did not hand over the scriptures and were therefore crowned?" Donatus responded, "Send me to God, and there I will explain myself." Then Secundus ordered him to step aside and stand as if guilty. Next, he called Marinus from Aquae Tibilitini, saying, "It is said that you also handed over the scriptures." Marinus replied that he had given some papers to Paulus, but his own codices were safe. Secundus also ordered him to step aside. Donatus of Calama, similarly questioned, replied that he had given away medical books, and with this response, he stood in the middle. Victor of Rusicada, accused by Secundus of handing over the 4 Gospels, openly and without evasion confessed to the crime. Valentinianus, the curator, forced me to send them. Forgive me this offense, and God forgives me. With this response, he was immediately ordered to stand with the guilty. Then Secundus accused Purpurius of Lamata not of handing over scriptures, but of murder, addressing him thus, "It is said that you killed your sister's 2 sons at Melium." This fierce and shameless man turned the accusation back on his accuser. "Do you think, Secundus," he said, "that I am frightened by you like the others? What did you do when you were detained by the curator and the council to hand over the scriptures? How did you get released from them unless you gave or ordered to give something? For they did not let you go freely." Then he burst into threats, "I killed, and I kill those who act against me. So don't provoke me to say more, you know I deal with no one." At the same time, all the accused began to murmur against Secundus. Seeing this, another Secundus, the son of his brother, addressed his uncle thus, "Do you hear what he says against you? He is ready to withdraw and create a schism, not just himself, but also everyone you accuse. I know they intend to leave you and pass judgment on you, and you will remain a heretic alone. So why does it matter to you what someone did? They have to give an account to God." Then Secundus of Tigcis, fearing this, consulted with Victor of Garba, Felix of Rotarium, and Nabor of Centurianus. The 3 remaining judges agreed with the judgment of Secundus the Younger, and decided that such a case should be reserved for God. He pronounced the acquittal of the accused and ordered them to sit. Then everyone said, "Thanks be to God," and they sat down. Ordination of Silvanus. Disagreement of the deacon Non-Denarius with Silvanus. This is the first part of the synod. The second part was the election and ordination of a bishop to replace the deceased. Silvanus, who had previously been mentioned and had voluntarily handed over a lamp and a silver vessel under Bishop Paul, was proposed to be ordained in his place. Then the people shouted, "He is a traitor. Make someone else. We want a pure and upright citizen." The clergy and honorable citizens opposed this election, but laborers, peasants, and others from the common people, hired for money, locked up the honorable citizens in the martyrs' area. They took Silvanus from the laborer Muto and proclaimed him bishop, whom Secundus and other bishops who had gathered at Cirta ordained. Subsequently, Silvanus, in the presence of the bishops, ordained Victor as a priest for this. Victor gave Silvanus 20 bags, which were placed before the bishops' chairs and divided among themselves. All this was revealed by Non-Denarius, the deacon of Silvanus, who was angry at his bishop for being removed from his position. This situation prompted Purpurius of Limatensis, and another bishop of the same faction named Forte, to write to Silvanus and the people of Cirta, stating that Non-Denarius's wounded spirit should be placated by any means necessary, lest he reveal what he knew. When this was not done, Silvanus presented these documents and witnesses before the proconsul Xenophilus, as the records show. Origin of the schism. Lucilla's dispute against Cecilian. Even though Secundus of Tigcis and Manchurius of Carthage did not get along well, as long as Manchurius was alive, there was no schism between them. However, after he died, the bishops who had attended the Council of Cirta ordained Majorinus, setting him against the previously ordained Cecilian. This caused the Church of Carthage, and later all of Africa, to split into 2 parts. The origin and causes of this division are best described in the words of Optatus himself. He said, Everyone knows that this schism happened in Carthage after the ordination of Caecilian, because of a certain troublesome woman named Lucilla. Before the peace of the church was disturbed by the storms of persecution, while the church was still at peace, she could not bear the rebuke of the archdeacon Caecilian. She was said to offer a drink to the mouth of some martyr, if indeed it was a martyr, before taking the spiritual food and drink. And when she placed the mouth of some dead person, although a martyr but not yet avenged, above the holy chalice, she was rebuked and left in anger and confusion. As she was angry and upset, a storm of persecution suddenly arose, preventing her from submitting to discipline. Menurius, summoned to court, entrusted the church's treasures to Optatus and Celestius. At the same time, a certain deacon named Felix, who had written some infamous letter about a tyrant emperor, was hiding with Bishop Menurius because he feared for his safety. When Menurius publicly denied having Felix, a report was sent, and a response came back ordering that if Menurius did not hand over Felix the deacon, he would be brought to the palace. The assembly suffered significant distress because there were numerous church ornaments made of gold and silver, which could neither be buried in the ground nor carried away. He entrusted something to the faithful and the elders, leaving a remembrance, and it is said he gave it to a certain old woman. If he did not return, the old woman was to give it to whoever she found seated on the episcopal throne once peace was restored to the Christians. He explained his reason for leaving. He was ordered to return but could not reach Carthage. The ordination of Caecilian as Bishop of Carthage, and the causes and origin of the schism. The storm of persecution had ended. By God's command, through Maxentius, freedom was restored to the Christians. Optatus and Celestius, desiring to be ordained at Carthage, made efforts so that, with the Numidians absent, only the neighboring bishops would be sought to perform the ordination at Carthage. Then, by the vote of all the people, Caecilian was chosen, and with Felix of Autumna laying hands on him, he was ordained bishop. Optatus and Celestius were disappointed in their hopes. A small amount of gold and silver was handed over to Caecilian, as had been delegated by Menurius, with witnesses present. The aforementioned elders, who had greedily consumed the entrusted spoils, were summoned. When they were forced to return it, they withdrew from communion. The ambitious ones who did not get ordained, and also Lucilla, who for a long time could not tolerate discipline, a powerful and factious woman with all her followers, refused to join the communion. Thus, with three causes and persons coming together, malice was able to take effect. Therefore, at that time the anger of a confused woman gave birth to the schism, ambition nurtured it, and greed strengthened it. From these three individuals, charges were contrived against Caecilian to claim his ordination was invalid. When to mark the beginning of the schism, these events occurred after the persecution ended, and freedom was restored to Christians in Africa by Maxentius's pardon. Therefore, this happened after he took control of Africa, which did not occur until after the death of Maximian Herculius, who passed away in the year 310. After Alexander, who was then acting as prefect of the Praetorian Guard in Africa and supported Galerius, was defeated and killed by Rufius Volusianus and Zenos, whom Maxentius had sent to Africa with troops, as testified by Zosimus and Aurelius Victor. Hence that pardon could not have been issued by Maxentius to Africa, and freedom could not have been restored to Christians by him before the year 311, which Eusebius testifies is the year the persecution ended in the western regions. Inspector of the Church of Carthage appointed by Secundus's clerics, before Caecilian was ordained, Secundus had already sent clerics to Carthage. Even though they did not want to approach the Carthaginian clerics, they were received by Lucilla and appointed an inspector, if we believe Augustine, who narrates this in Sermon 46, about pastors, chapter 15. At this time, the Church of Carthage was also disturbed by Donatus of Cassinigrae, who, according to the same witness in the Breviculum of the third day of the conference, was convicted in the Roman Council for having caused a schism in Carthage while Caecilian was still a deacon. Council of 70 Numidians in Carthage. Accusation of Caecilian. Secundus and the bishops of Numidia were called to Carthage for the ordination of a bishop, and they found Caecilian already ordained. They were upset at not being waited for, especially Secundus the primate, who thought it fitting that a prince should be ordained by a prince, that is, a primate by a primate. But the Carthaginian clergy and people, who had long disliked Secundus and the Numidians, did not want to receive them. Instead, they were received by those who hated Caecilian, namely, Lucilla and her supporters, by the elders who had been entrusted with the sacred ornaments, and by Optatus and Celestius, who were resentful for not being ordained. According to Augustine, around 70 bishops from Numidia were present. Among them were those who had attended the Council of Cirta, including traitors and murderers, along with Silvanus of Cirta and Donatus from Cassinigrae, the chief instigator of the dissension. Instead of going to the basilica where the Christians met, they held their assembly in a private house. Caecilian, confident in his innocence, conveyed this message to them: "If there is anything to be proven against me, let the accuser come forward and prove it." At that time, Optatus says, nothing could be fabricated against him by so many enemies. However, he deserved to be defamed concerning his ordainer, who was falsely called a traitor by them. Cecilian again sent a message that if Felix, as they thought, had done nothing wrong, they should ordain Cecilian as if he were still a deacon. Then Purpurius, relying on his usual malice, as if Cecilian were his nephew, said, "Let him come forth as if hands were to be laid on him in episcopal ordination, and let his head be shaken in penance." When these things were discovered, the whole church held on to Cecilian, so he would not betray himself to the traitors. They condemned Cecilian in his absence because he did not want to appear when called, because he had been ordained by traitors, and because he was said to have forbidden food to be brought to the martyrs in custody. After the sentence of deposition and excommunication was passed on him and his ordainers, they illicitly ordained Majorinus, who had been a reader while Cecilian was archdeacon, in his place with the support of Lucilla, who had been bribed with her silver, for it was later discovered that she had given 400 coins to the bishops for this purpose. Thus an altar was set up against an altar, marking the beginning of schism and dissension. Letters of the Synod against Cecilian. The division of Africa? Cecilian remains in communion with the entire world. After the verdict was given, letters were sent, as is customary, in the name of the council to the African churches. These letters, written under the dictation of Tavor as Optatus mentions, accused Cecilian's ordainers of being guilty of betrayal, declared Cecilian's ordination invalid, and advised everyone to abstain from his communion and recognize Majorinus as the legitimate bishop. Many Africans believe the letters sent by the numerous council against Cecilian. As a result, not only the Church of Carthage but the entire African Church was divided into two parts. Some defended Cecilian's innocence and remained in communion with him, while others stood with Majorinus and departed from Cecilian's communion. Since Cecilian's opponents did not dare to bring this matter to the overseas churches at that time, Cecilian remained in communion with the churches of the entire world. Majorinus, however, had no one outside of Africa who would communicate with him or consider him the bishop of Carthage. Letters of communion were sent to Cecilian from all overseas churches, but not to Majorinus. Constantine recognizes Cecilianus as the legitimate bishop. After defeating Maxentius in 312, Emperor Constantine incorporated Italy and Africa into his empire. He directed that funds for the Catholic Church in Africa, Numidia, and both Mauritania be distributed by Cecilianus, the rightful bishop of Carthage. In his letters, Constantine harshly criticizes the schismatics, calling them people of disordered minds who corrupt the Holy Catholic Church with deceitful lies. He instructed Annulinus, the proconsul and patrician, to handle this issue. Constantine told Cecilianus to report any persistent offenders to the judges so they could take action as commanded. Cecilianus's opponents submitted petitions against him to the proconsul, requesting that the emperor assign judges to their case. Writing to Annulinus about the exemption of clergy in Africa, the emperor stated that only those serving in the Catholic Church, led by Cecilianus, were exempt from public duties. Annulinus summoned Cecilianus and the Carthaginian clergy, read the imperial decree, and encouraged them to act in unity to enjoy their granted exemption and serve divine matters without hindrance. A few days later, some opponents of Cecilianus gathered a crowd and approached the proconsul with two petitions, one sealed in leather, labeled Petition of the Catholic Church regarding the crimes of Cecilianus, submitted by the party of Majorinus, and the other unsealed but attached to the same leather. They requested that these petitions be sent to the imperial court. Annulinus reported this matter to the emperor in a letter from Carthage on the 17th day before the calends. In May, Constantine Augustus, serving as consul for the third time in the year 313, received petitions and a report from the emperor to understand everything. Annulinus sent them. Meanwhile, Cecilianus remained in his position. The unsigned petition requested judges from Gaul. Optatus records it with these words: "We ask you, Constantine, excellent emperor, since you come from a just family, whose father, unlike other emperors, did not persecute, and from this crime, Gaul is exempt. In Africa, there are disputes between us and the other bishops. We ask that your piety order judges to be sent to us from Gaul." This petition was given by Lucianus, Dignus, Nasucius, Capito, Fidenti, and other bishops of the Donatist party, or rather Majorinus, as noted here. Constantine sent 3 bishops from Gaul to be judges who would decide the matter in Rome, along with Miltiades, the Roman bishop. Emperor Constantine, upon receiving the report from proconsul Annulinus in Gaul, where he was at the time, and the attached petitions, was greatly distressed. He expressed this in a letter to Miltiades. In those provinces which divine providence had delivered to his devotion by spontaneous surrender, and in which there was a great multitude of people, the population was almost divided into 2 parts, turning to worse things, and the bishops were disagreeing among themselves. So, to put an end to the discord, Constantine appointed 3 bishops from Gaul as judges, Maternus of Cologne, Rutitius of Autun, and Marinus of Arles, who, along with Miltiades, the Roman bishop, would judge the matter in Rome. He also commanded Annulinus to instruct Cecilianus, along with 10 bishops of his party, and Cecilianus's opponents, also 10 in number, to sail to Rome by the 6th day before the nones of October, so that their case could be judged there by the episcopal court. To ensure the judges assigned to this case had complete knowledge, he sent copies of the documents from Annulinus to each of them, along with letters encouraging them to examine the matter thoroughly and judge according to the principles of justice. There's a letter addressed to Miltiades, appointing him as the judge of this case along with Rutitius, Maternus, and Marinus, his colleagues. Both parties were to be sent to Rome. The Roman council under Miltiades declared Cecilian innocent, and passed a judgment against Donatus. Following the emperor's command, Annulinus ordered Cecilian and his opponents to each send 10 representatives to Rome. When both parties agreed to comply, he informed the emperor. Thus, Cecilian, along with 10 bishops from his side and 10 from his opponents, led by Donatus of Cossi Nigri, came to Rome. Also present were 3 Gallican bishops appointed by Constantine, who, along with Miltiades and 15 Italian bishops, whose names and locations Optatus records in Book 1 Section 23, assembled in Fausta's house in the Lateran, the part of the Lateran palace designated for Empress Fausta, during the consulship of Constantine III and Licinius for the second time, in the year 313, on the 6th day before the nones of October, a Friday. With these 19 bishops seated, the case of Cecilian and Donatus began to be heard. The matter was discussed over 3 days, with notaries present to record the proceedings. On the first day, Cecilian and his accusers stood before the judges. The character of the accusers was examined, and some who had blemished reputations were dismissed from the case according to the law. The remaining accusers were asked to present evidence and witnesses against Cecilian, but they couldn't produce anything against him. They only claimed that Cecilian had been accused by the entire populace of Carthage. However, the judges decided that an accusation based solely on noisy clamor, without any documentary evidence or reliable witnesses, should not be considered valid. They asked them to bring forward certain accusers and witnesses who had come from Africa with them, and who were said to have been hidden by Donatus because they had testified that they had nothing to say against Cecilian. He promised to present them, and so Cecilian's case remained unresolved. However, Donatus of Cossi was accused and convicted while Cecilian was still the archdeacon, for causing a schism in Carthage and admitting that he had rebaptized and laid hands on fallen bishops. On the second day, a new complaint against Cecilian was submitted, and with that the examination was reopened. Still, nothing could be proven against Cecilian. On the same day, there was a discussion about the council of 70 bishops who had condemned Cecilian, whose authority was considered very significant. Many things were said against them, that they were traitors, enemies of Cecilian, ambitious men, subservient to Lucilla, and corrupted by her money, among other things. It was also alleged that Cecilian had been ordained by Felix of Aptunga, who was guilty of handing over scriptures. These questions were many and very complex, which the Roman Council Fathers decided to avoid, and they only wanted to pass judgment on Cecilian and Donatus. Donatus again promised to present suitable witnesses to Cecilian's crimes the next day, but since he could not keep his promises, he refused to attend the judgment any further. Thus, on the third day, Cecilian was declared innocent by everyone, and communion with him was maintained. Conversely, Donatus was convicted by each person's own confession, and sentences were passed against him. Regarding the other bishops who had condemned Cecilian, nothing was declared against them, and none were expelled from the communion of the Church. Instead, all the bishops of Majorinus's faction were given the option to return to unity and remain in their positions, even if they had been ordained outside the Church by Majorinus. If there were 2 bishops ordained, one by Cecilian and the other by Majorinus, the one who was ordained first would be confirmed, and another congregation would be provided for the second bishop. This information comes from Optatus, Book 1, Section 24, and Augustine, Letter 43, and the summary of the discussion on the third day. After these actions were completed, Miltiades and the other bishops sent everything that had been done in the council, along with the acts of the council itself, to Emperor Constantine, asserting that their judgment had been made with fairness, and stating that those who thought to act against Cecilian were the ones at fault. What happened in Africa after the Roman Synod? After this judgment, it is believed that the event described by Optatus in Book 1 Section 26 happened as follows. At the same time, Donatus himself requested permission to return but not to go to Carthage. Then his supporter Philomeno suggested to the emperor that for the sake of peace, Cecilian should be kept in Brixia, and it was done. Then 2 bishops, Eunomius and Olympius, were sent to Africa. They came and stayed in Carthage for 40 days to declare where the Catholic Church was. The seditious faction of Donatus did not allow this to happen. There were daily disturbances due to the partisanship. The final judgment of the bishops Eunomius and Olympius read as follows. They declared that the Catholic Church was the one spread throughout the entire world, and that the decision made by 19 bishops long ago could not be overturned. Thus they communicated with the clergy of Cecilian and returned. We have volumes of records on these matters, which anyone can read in the latest parts. While these things were happening, Donatus himself voluntarily returned to Carthage first. Upon hearing this, Cecilian hurried to his congregation. This stirred up the factions once again. New riots broke out from the Donatist faction against Sicilian. The Donatist faction, persisting in their stubbornness, began to incite new riots throughout Africa. Some of them even approached the emperor to accuse Sicilian again. When the emperor responded that their claims were in vain, as the matter had been settled in Rome by competent and respected bishops, they argued strongly that their entire case had not been heard. They claimed that the bishops had secluded themselves and judged the matter to suit their own interests. New complaints to the emperor followed from them. Actions were brought before Aelianus, the proconsul of Africa, regarding the innocence of Felix of Aptonga. Moved by these events, Emperor Constantine, to finally put an end to the disputes, ordered the case of Felix of Aptonga to be examined in a public court in Africa. He convened a council far larger than the previous one in the city of Arles, so that the entire case of Sicilian could be reviewed again. He then wrote to Verus, the vicar of Africa, to publicly investigate the life of Felix of Aptonga, and the crime of tradition for which he was accused. However, since Verus was in poor health, Aelianus, the proconsul, handled the inquiry in his place. He summoned Alfio Sicilian, who had been the curator of the municipality of Autima Tenorum during the time of persecution, along with the scribe Ingentius and other necessary witnesses, including Claudius, Saturninus, Callidius, Gratian, Superius the stationer, Solon the public servant, and others. The municipal acts were read. Saturninus and Callidius Jr., the trustees, Superius, the station officer, and Caecilianus, the duumvir, were questioned, and Ingentius was subjected to interrogation. After hearing all of them, the proconsul gave this sentence: "It is clear that Felix, the devout bishop, is free from the accusation of burning the divine instruments, as no one could prove that he handed over or burned the most sacred scriptures. The investigation of all the above mentioned has revealed that no divine scriptures were found, corrupted, or burned. It is documented that Felix, the devout bishop, was neither present at that time, nor did he give his consent, nor did he order such an act to be done. On the contrary, Ingentius was convicted of adding certain things to the letters of Alfii Siciliani, which accused Felix of the crime of handing over the scriptures. He was thrown into prison, where he was detained until the following year, when Constantine wrote to Probinus, the successor of the proconsul Aelianus, to send him to the court. These acts were completed by Aelianus Volusianus and Annianus, consuls, on the 15th day before the calends of March, that is, on the 15th day of February in the year 314, 4 months after the Roman Synod. Letters of Constantine convened the Council of Arles. In the same year, in the month of August, the Council of Arles was held. Constantine wrote to Elipius, also known by some as Oblavius or Elanus, the proconsul of Africa. He instructed him to arrange for Sicilian, along with other bishops he chose, as well as some from the provinces of Byzacania, Tripolitania, Numidia, and Mauritania, and even some of his opponents, to be transported with public provision through Africa and Mauritania to Spain, so they would arrive at Arles by August 1st. The emperor also sent letters to the bishops he wanted to attend the council, commanding them to use public transport to reach the city of Arles by August 1st. He had planned for bishops from various and almost countless places to be present, so the case of Sicilian and the Donatists, already judged, could be resolved after hearing the parties again. An exemplar of this letter written to Chrestus of Syracuse was reported by Eusebius, and it is reasonable to believe that similar exemplars were sent to the other bishops. In the letter directed to Chrestus, he was given the authority to bring along 2 secondary rank members, which I assume means priests, deacons or other clerics, and 3 servants as his travel companions. The same was granted to the other bishops, as it is evident from the fact that priests, deacons and several other clerics were present, and signed along with the bishops at the council. There is a debate among writers about the number of bishops at the Council of Arles. Adu wrote that there were 600, but he is not very credible in this matter. Baronius suspected there were 200, based on a corrupted passage of Augustine, Book 1 against Parmenion, Chapter 5. After mentioning the Roman judgment under Miltiades, whom the Donatists accused of Tradition 7, it was noted, "So foolish are men that they believe that 200 judges by whom they were defeated should be disregarded by the losing litigants." Baronius believed that the reference to 200 judges here pertains to the Council of Arles. However, this actually concerns the Roman Council, which undoubtedly had only 19 bishops. In the genuine text of Augustine, there is no mention of 200 judges. Instead, as restored from an old Vatican manuscript in the latest edition of Augustine's works, it should read, "People are so foolish that they believe the litigants who lost over the judges by whom they were defeated." This reading is clearly genuine because all the handwritten manuscripts omit the final words "to be postponed," which were added by the Louvain editors to make some sense. When the word "against" was perhaps expressed by the scribe with a double "se" or "cc," subsequent copyists turned this into the number 200. Therefore, Baronius's conjecture collapses on all fronts, and the number of bishops at the Council of Arles must be gathered from elsewhere. Constantine, in a letter to Chrestus, said that he had ordered many bishops from various and almost countless places to gather in the city of Arles before the 1st of August. These words suggest that this council was very numerous. However, it is first acknowledged by all that only bishops from the western parts under Constantine's rule were called. Among the 33 whose names appear in the subscriptions, there are bishops from all parts of the West: Italy, Apulia, Dalmatia, Gaul, Britain, Sardinia, Sicily, Spain, and Africa. Nothing prevents saying that bishops from such diverse regions were gathered from various and almost countless places. Additionally, it is uncertain whether all the bishops called by Constantine attended. There are only two sources from which the number and names of the bishops who attended that council can be gathered, namely the superscription of the council's letter and the council's subscriptions. The authority of the superscription is more certain, as the subscriptions vary and are quite disordered and corrupted. However, the number of bishops on both sides is equal, not exceeding 33, and the names are almost the same, with one illuminating and correcting the other. In the superscription, the first mentioned is Marinus of Arles, followed by Acratius, who is better known in the subscriptions as Agricius of Trier. Then there are Theodorus of Aquileia, Natalis, a priest of the city of Ursulensium, possibly of Urgel, Proterius, bishop of Capua, Votius of Lyon, Varus of Vienne, Probationus or Probatius, a priest of Tarragona, Caecilianus of Carthage, Faustinus, a priest of the city of Orange, Sergentius, bishop of the city of Pacopheltes, possibly the village of Biltes in Africa, Gregorius of Porto, Reticius of Autun, Ambitausis or Ambitausis of Rheims, Termatius, a priest of the city of Bastia, Maricles of Milan, Pardus of Arpitanus, Adelphius of the colony of London, Hibernius, possibly Aborius of York, Fortunatus, bishop of Caesarea in Mauritania, Aristatius, possibly Anastasius of Benevento, Lampadius of Udine, Vitalis of Varensis in proconsular Africa, Maternus of Cologne, Liberius of Merida, another Gregorius whose name and place are not found in the subscriptions, Crescens, who might be the same as Crestus of Syracuse, Avitianus of Rouen, Daphnis of Vaison, Orientalis of Bordeaux, Quintetius of Cagliari, Victor of Utica, and Epictetus of Centumulae. Valesius, considering the names of all these bishops, concluded that 33 bishops were present at the Synod of Arles. Among those 33, it is certain from the subscriptions that there were 4 priests: Natalis, Probatius, Faustinus, and Termatius. This leaves 29 bishops. From the subscriptions, we must add Aurelius of Marseille, Mamertinus of Alusa, Restitutus of London, Faustus of Tuberbo, and Victor from the city of Legis Volumini or Legis in Numidia, whose names were omitted in the superscription of the synodal letter. This brings the total to 34 bishops, plus 15 priests, 25 deacons, 6 exorcists, and 2 readers, whose names are listed in the subscriptions. These were the fathers who attended the Council of Arles. Marinus of Arles presided over the assembly, and his name is first in the superscription of the synodal letter. 2 other judges, Maternus and Agratius, who had participated in the previous judgment, were also present. Sylvester, who succeeded Miltiades as the Roman pontiff, couldn't leave the city. He sent Claudian and Vitus, his priestly legates, along with 2 deacons to fulfill his duties. Although bishops from all parts of the West gathered for this council, most were from Gaul, with 16 Gallic bishops listed in the subscriptions. The bishops gathered in the city of Arles on the 1st day of August, under the consulate of Volusianus II and Annianus, in the year 314, to re-examine the case of Cecilian. The accused and the accusers were present, and the council said this in the synodal letter: "We have endured men of grave and pernicious conduct to our law and tradition, of unrestrained mind, whom both the present authority of our God and the tradition and rule of truth have so rejected, that no rationale of speaking could persist in them, nor could any mode of accusation or proof be appropriate." Cecilianus was declared innocent of their accusations, but they themselves, judged by God and the Mother Church, these are the words of the synodal letter of the Council, which knows and approves its own members, were either condemned or rejected. The main accusers and authors of the schism were condemned, while the others were expelled from communion until they returned to the Catholic Church. It was decided that clerics among the Donatists could remain in their positions, and the same rule applied to bishops as established before in the Roman Council. In places where there was only one bishop of the Majoranus party, he would stay there. However, where there was one bishop from the Caecilianus communion and another from the Majoranus, the one ordained first would be confirmed, while the other would either lead another congregation or remain in the same church with the honor and dignity of a bishop. Upon the colleague's departure, he would succeed in his place. For this reason, the council in the synodal letter to Sylvester hinted that they had dealt more leniently with the schismatics, writing to him, Would that, dearest brother, you had been able to be present at this spectacle. We truly believe that a harsher sentence would have been pronounced against them, and with you judging alongside us, our assembly would have rejoiced with greater joy. Canons of the Council of Arles. After concluding the case for which the bishops had been convened in the city of Arles, they decided not only to address the matters they had been invited for, but also to provide guidance to their churches and issue laws to be observed in their provinces. Thus they enacted 22 canons and sent them to Pope Sylvester, so that through him, who presided over the foremost and principal church of the world, they might be made known to the other churches. The canons of the council against the betrayers and concerning the baptism of heretics. 2 canons from this council are especially relevant to our discussion today. The 13th canon states, "Those who are said to have handed over the Holy Scriptures, the Lord's vessels, or the names of their brothers, should be removed from the clergy." However, since many who oppose the Church's rule believe they should be admitted to accusation through bribed witnesses, it's established that they should not be admitted unless they can prove from public records that the crime of betrayal was committed by those they accuse. The ordination of those ordained by betrayers is declared not invalid, nor should it harm the ordained in any way. These 2 points are pertinent to the case of Salvianus. First, because the crime of betrayal, which his adversaries accused Felix, Mansurius, and other Catholic bishops of, could not be proven from public records, but was only alleged through public rumor or witnesses bribed to defame them. Second, because they attacked Salvianus's ordination on the grounds that he was ordained by Felix of Aptunga and other bishops accused of betrayal. This reason held no weight as soon as the ordination by a betrayer was declared not invalid. The other relevant canon is the 8th, concerning the baptism of heretics, which states, "Regarding the Africans who use their own law to rebaptize, it is decided that if someone comes to the church from heresy, they should be asked about their creed, and if it is found that they were baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, they should only have hands laid on them to receive the Holy Spirit. But if, when asked, they do not respond with this Trinity, they should be baptized." This canon limits the practice of rebaptizing those who came to the Church in Africa to only those heretics who did not recognize the Trinity and thus were not baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, in the faith of the Trinity. The Council does not say they should be asked about the form of baptism but about the faith. Ask them about the creed. If he is asked and does not respond about the Trinity, he should be baptized. This definition aligns with Optatus's opinion on the baptism of heretics. In Book 1, Section 10. Optatus acknowledges that the points Parmenianus made about faulty and invalid baptism apply to those heretics who falsified the creed and held incorrect beliefs about the Trinity. Optatus insists on the same faith in the Trinity in Book 5, Sections 3, 4 and 8, for those receiving baptism. He criticizes the Donatists for demanding a second creed after a person, having been baptized, had already professed faith in the Trinity. It's important to note that the Canon of Arles we are discussing was not aimed at the faction of Majorinus, but addressed the African practice of re-baptizing those baptized by heretics when they joined the Church. This council moderated that practice with this canon. The Synodal Letter of the Council of Arles. The bishops who gathered in Arles wrote a synodal letter to Pope Sylvester before departing, informing him of their actions. They also sent him the canons they had established so he could share them with other churches. Additionally, they wrote to the emperor, requesting permission to leave. Meanwhile, members of the faction of Majorinus approached Constantine, seeking his judgment. Constantine initially reacted with disdain, exclaiming, "Oh, the rabid audacity of fury!" Just as it usually happens in cases of the Gentiles, they have lodged an appeal. He was indignant that they would not accept the bishop's judgment, and sought a ruling from secular courts. Consequently, Constantine wrote to the bishops of the Council of Arles, strongly criticizing the obstinacy of these men. He praised the council's judgment, and asked the bishops to follow Christ's example of patience, giving the schismatics another chance to reconsider. If the schismatics persisted in their decision, the bishops were to return to their own seats. Finally, in the same letter, he informed them that he had sent his officials to Arles to bring the stubborn ones to the court, and had given letters to the vicar of Africa, instructing him to immediately send anyone he found to be of similar madness to the court, so that the turmoil and dissension could eventually be ended. The appeal of the Donatists to the emperor, Caecilian and his opponents were summoned. Upon receiving this news, many of Donatus' followers, fearing the emperor's anger, reconciled with Caecilian. However, those who were more stubborn were brought to the court. These individuals, either personally or through supporters they had in the palace, did not cease to petition the emperor to judge between the parties. Although Constantine initially refused, he was eventually persuaded by the constant petitions of the Donatists, and decided to render a judgment on Caecilian's innocence to completely silence them. At first, he had planned to summon Caecilian from Africa, but upon the request of the Donatist bishops, he changed his mind and ordered that the bishops from Donatus's faction who were in the court return to Africa so that the entire case against Caecilian could be heard and resolved by friends or judges they chose. However, the emperor soon realized that if the case were tried in Africa, the judgment might be disrupted by some unruly members of the Donatist faction and not be according to the truth. Or, even if the case were rightly judged, the stubborn minds might refuse to accept the judgment. Therefore, he decided to summon Caecilian and his opponents to the court, so he could judge between them himself. He then wrote both to Caecilian and to his opposing bishops, asking them to come to Rome, where he was residing in August of the year 315, as is evident from the Theodosian Code. There is a letter from him to the bishops who opposed Caecilian. In it, after explaining his change of mind, he promises them that if they could prove even one of the crimes they accused Caecilian of in his presence, it would be as if all the charges were proven. Around the same time, he wrote to Probinus, the proconsul of Africa, asking him to send Ingentius, a decurion of the people of Zica, to the court under suitable escort. Ingentius had been convicted of forging Felix's letter before Aelianus, Probinus's predecessor, and was imprisoned by his order. This was so that those who were constantly petitioning could see and be informed in person that they had no grounds to accuse Bishop Caecilian, and intended to rise violently against him. Thus, such disputes would be put aside, and the people could serve their religion with due reverence without any dissension. On the appointed day, Caecilian, for some unknown reason, did not show up in Rome as ordered. His opponents who had come to the court petitioned the emperor to pass a sentence against Caecilian as if he were in contempt, but the emperor, granting a delay, ordered them to follow him to Milan. Some, however, were displeased that Constantine refused to condemn Caecilian in his absence, and suspected he favored Caecilian and was hostile to them, so they began to flee. When the prudent emperor learned of this, he ordered the remaining ones to be brought to Milan under guard by officials. Those who had secretly withdrawn from the court, when they reached Africa, stirred up new riots there. Their leader and standard-bearer was the violent Manalius, who, persisting in his old rage, was ready to incite sedition. However, Domitius Celsus, the deputy of Africa, suppressed the riot they were preparing. When Constantine was informed of this matter by Celsus, he wrote to let him know that he would soon be coming to Africa, and would pass judgment there after a diligent investigation. He planned to punish the seditious and irreligious. With this plan, he allowed the bishops of the Donatists, Lucian, Capito, Fidentius, and Nasucius, along with the presbyter Honorius, who had come to Gaul by the emperor's order to accuse Caecilian, to return to their homes. He also ordered the praetorian prefects to provide them with transportation and provisions to the port of Arles, so they could sail from there to Africa. They informed Celsus, the vicar of Africa, of this matter in a letter dated April 28, 316. The emperor's judgment in favor of Caecilian. Finally, Constantine decided to judge Caecilian's case without traveling to Africa. When Caecilian and his adversaries came to Milan, where Constantine was staying in November 316, the emperor examined the case privately. After listening to both sides' claims and thoroughly discussing and investigating all controversies, he found none of the accusations against Caecilian could be proven by his accusers. He declared Caecilian innocent and his accusers to be malicious. He sent a rescript of this judgment to Eumalium, the vicar of Africa, dated November 10, 316, during the consulship of Sabinus and Rufinus. About Donatus of Carthage. Meanwhile, Majorinus passed away, and in his place, the bishops of his communion ordained Donatus at Carthage. This was not the frequently mentioned Donatus, the bishop of Caesarum Negrensium, but another of the same name who claimed leadership among his followers, and from whom the Donatists took their name. There was a man who excelled in the humanities. He was eloquent, learned, and commendable for his moral integrity and self-control. However, he was so proud that he considered no one comparable to himself. He treated the bishops under his authority as if they were his servants, and disdained all people, even emperors and magistrates appointed by them. He held such authority among his followers that everyone revered him, swore by him, and instead of calling him a bishop, the people referred to him as Donatus of Carthage. He divided all of Africa into two parts, designating one part as his own. Those who came to Carthage from various provinces of Africa did not inquire about the usual topics such as rain, peace, or the year's harvest. Instead, their first words to each person were, "What is happening with my faction in your area?" Consequently, not only were his followers commonly called Donatists, but they themselves declared in official documents and public records that they were part of Donatus's faction. When this was reproached to them during the Carthaginian conference, although they rejected the name, they still spoke so highly of Donatus as their leader through the mouth of Petilianus Donatus, a man of blessed memory and martyrial glory, our predecessor. Note these words by which he is called the predecessor not only of one bishop of Carthage but of all the bishops of these parts, we rightfully venerate as an ornament of the church of this city. He not only propagated schism throughout Africa with his influence and various strategies, but also attempted to defend it through his writings. During Jerome's time, many of his works relevant to his heresy existed, including a book about the Holy Spirit which was reported to align with Arian doctrine. Speaking of his writings, St. Augustine also noted that Donatus did not hold a Catholic view of the Trinity. Although he believed in the same substance, He considered the Son to be lesser than the Father, and the Holy Spirit to be lesser than the Son. Indeed, he says, the multitude of Donatists was not primarily focused on this error about the Trinity, nor is it easy to find anyone among them who knew he held this belief. However, Augustine testifies elsewhere in letter 185 to Count Boniface, that some did share the same view with Donatus. Nearly all profess to believe the same thing about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as the Catholic Church believes, although some of them, wanting to win over the Goths, would claim to believe what the Goths believed when they saw them gaining power. But Augustine says they are refuted by the authority of their elders, because even Donatus himself is not said to have believed this way, despite their boasting of being part of him. This might be why Epiphanius and Theodoret wrongly attributed the Arian error to the Donatists. However, their disputes were not about matters of faith, but rather about communion, the Church, and the authority of the sacraments administered in it. On this last point, Donatus signed a letter arguing that Christ's baptism should be believed to exist only within his communion. Augustine wrote a book against this letter, which no longer exists, but its argument is mentioned in Retractations, Book 1, Chapter 21. Constantine's laws on the Donatists. As the number and fury of the Donatists grew, Emperor Constantine passed a very severe law against them, ordering their basilicas and gathering places to be taken from them and given to the treasury. This severity not only failed to suppress their insolence, but even ignited it further. Instead of being brought back to the embrace of the Catholic Church, they became even more fiercely and petulantly hostile towards it. When Constantine learned of this, he wrote a very prudent and gentle letter to all the bishops and the people of the Catholic Church across Africa, saying that he had tried through all humane and moderate means, as his faith and wisdom allowed, to ensure that the peace of the most holy brotherhood, established through concord, would be maintained. Due to the stubbornness of certain people, plans should be managed in such a way that, until divine intervention occurs, we must patiently endure the actions of the most wicked individuals. Do not repay injury with injury. Leave their vengeance to God. By observing this, it is hoped that soon, by the grace of the Most High, the weakening of their institutions and customs will cause those who instigate conflict to fall silent. However, those who were not restrained by severity, nor tamed by the gentleness and mildness of the best prince, actually became bolder from his indulgence, and harassed the Catholics more severely each day. At that time, the Circumcellions emerged, rustic and wild men who roamed around cellars, harassing and robbing Catholics at the behest of the Donatist bishops, even going so far as to kill some of them. Constantine's words seem to apply to them in a recently praised letter, since our faith should trust that whatever it suffers from the fury of such men will be considered martyrdom before God. Among the leaders of the Donatists was Silvanus, bishop of the people of Constantine. He was ordained by the original authors of the schism, although he had been tainted by the crime of tradition when he was a deacon. He had a deacon named Honorius, who knew all the secrets of this sect. When Silvanus excommunicated him and refused to reconcile, Honorius exposed everything. He revealed that Silvanus was a traditor, and that money from Lucilla was used to ordain Majorinus as bishop. These revelations were of great importance and significantly harmed the Donatists' cause. It proved that they were guilty of the same crime they accused the Church of, and that Majorinus's ordination was invalid. The Catholics demanded that these claims be verified through public records and before a judge. The matter was entrusted to Xenophilus, the consul of Numidia, and was addressed on the Ides of December in the 6th consulship of Constantine the Great Augustus, and the 1st consulship of Constantine the Younger Noble Caesar, which was the year 320 AD. The records of Munatius Felix, curator of the people of Cirta, were produced during the consulship of Diocletian for the 8th time and Maximian for the 7th time, on May 19. These records show that Silvanus voluntarily handed over a lamp and silver items. Letters were read from Purpurius of Lamata, Fortis, and another bishop in favor of Honorius. From these letters, it was clear how much they feared that Honorius might reveal what he knew. Witnesses testified that Silvanus had been proclaimed bishop by the Irenarii against the wishes of the leading and honorable citizens of Cirta, and then ordained. They also confirmed that he had been openly accused of betrayal. They added that money had been given to Silvanus and other bishops by Victor to ordain him as a presbyter, and that casks of vinegar had been taken from the temple of Serapis by bishops Silvanus and Purpurius, as well as by presbyters Dontius and Superius and deacon Lucianus. Witnesses also testified about money given by Lucilla to the Numidian bishops to ordain Majorinus as bishop. We have most of these records, but the judgment of Xenophilus is missing, although it is certain that Silvanus was declared a traitor. Immediately Silvanus was sent into exile, not because he refused to associate with Ursatius and Xenophilus, as Cresconius claimed, but, as Augustine states in Book 3 against this Donatist, chapter 30, because, having been a traitor, he also wanted to remain a heretic, so that he could have false honor in the Donatist faction. which he could not have in the Catholic Church with such manifest acts of his betrayal revealed by public judgment. It is also known that at that time Ursacius, the count in Africa, opposed the fury of the Donatists and fought for the Catholics against them. Hence the Donatists slandered him as the primary instigator of the storm raised against them. The petitions of the Donatists to Constantine, which he granted. Since Ursacius would not allow the Donatists to act wildly, and force them to join the Catholic Church, they submitted a petition to Emperor Constantine in the year 321, requesting the freedom to act independently, and not be forced into communion with Sicilian against their will. They added that they would in no way associate with that scoundrel bishop, and were prepared to endure whatever he wanted to do to them. Referring to Sicilian, whom the emperor had declared innocent and recognized as the legitimate bishop of Carthage, they also asked the emperor to recall Salvianus and his colleagues from exile. In response, the merciful emperor, instead of getting angry as he rightfully could have, granted them everything they asked for with his usual kindness. He wrote back to Valerius or Varinus, the vicar of Africa, instructing him to allow them to act freely and leave their madness to God's judgment. At the same time, he permitted those in exile to return home. This response was given on May 5, 330. The harassment of Catholics by Donatists. Constantine's laws in favor of the Catholics. This excessive leniency of the emperor caused members of the Donatist faction to attack Catholics more freely, especially in Numidia, where Donatus' side was more numerous and powerful. Among other things, they forcibly took over a basilica that the emperor had ordered to be built in the city of Constantine, the metropolis of Numidia, formerly called Cirta. Despite frequent warnings from Catholic bishops and judges on the emperor's orders, they refused to return it. Furthermore, they incited city councilors and leaders with malicious suggestions to recall readers, subdeacons, and other clergy of the Catholic Church to city council roles and public duties. Because of this, the bishops of the Catholic Church throughout Numidia were forced to write to the emperor and seek his help. Knowing the emperor's inclination toward kindness and patience, they did not seek revenge against their enemies or demand that he use his power to return the basilica to them. Instead, they asked for a different place from the treasury to build a new church. The emperor, after criticizing the Donatists and praising the Catholic bishops for their patience, granted their request. He sent letters to the Rational, instructing him to transfer a property from the treasury to the Catholic Church, and ordered that a basilica be built there at the treasury's expense. He also commanded the consular to assist the bishops in the church's construction, and decreed that the readers, subdeacons and other clerics of the Catholic Church should not be compelled to perform public duties or join the council. Those who had been called to such duties by the Donatists were to be released. This law is found in the Theodosian Code, Law 7, concerning bishops, addressed to Valentinus, the consular of Numidia, in almost the same words as those in Constantine's letter to the bishops of Numidia. It states, "Let the readers of the Holy Scriptures, the subdeacons, and other clerics who have been wrongfully summoned to the council by the heretics be released, and henceforth, unlike in the East, let them not be summoned to the councils, but enjoy full immunity." This law, like the letter, was dated the 5th of February at Serdica. However, the names of the consuls, which are not included in the letter, are found in the law, Gallicanus and Symmachus, whose consulship was in the year 330. Thus we refer to Constantine's letter and the entire matter concerning the Constantinian Basilica to this year, rather than to 317 or 318, as suspected by Henri Valois. The teachings of the Donatists. The Donatists believed that the churches of the whole world adhered to the communion of Sicilian and were separate from their own. They went so far as to claim that the Catholic Church existed only in their part of the world, and had been extinguished elsewhere due to the contagion of communion. They stubbornly held on to the old African belief that outside the true Church, baptism and other sacraments were invalid. As a result, they required anyone who came to them, having been baptized in churches they deemed adulterous, to be baptized again. They detested the sacrifices and sacred rites of the Catholics, considering them impure. They trampled on the Eucharist consecrated by Catholics, viewed the making of chrism, holy anointing, ordinations, and all other sacraments as invalid. They even scraped or burned altars they believed defiled by impure sacrifices, broke chalices, and washed the walls and floors of churches with water. They regarded the priesthoods of bishops and the vows of virgins made among the Catholics as worthless. Ultimately, they completely abhorred communion with the Catholics. These teachings stemmed from their false belief that the Church had perished throughout the world, and from the old doctrine of the African bishops that nothing could be valid and effective outside the Church. They claimed the Church had perished because Sicilian, ordained by Felix of Aptunga, whom they accused of handing over sacred books, and other known traitors had been accepted as bishops and not expelled from their communion. They believed the true Church should consist only of people who appeared holy and just. They acknowledged that there were bad people mixed with the good in the Church, but only secretly, not publicly or openly. The early Church was strict. Communion was denied to those who associated with idolaters and other serious sinners expelled from the Church. At the start of the schism, when Salvianus was condemned by a council of 70 bishops, some who refused to associate with him could be excused, but after later judgments declared him innocent, only the stubborn could avoid his communion, especially since he had been condemned by judges who lacked the authority. When the entire church outside Africa communicated with him, claiming the Catholic Church had perished because of this was sheer madness. Initially, those opposing the Donatists aimed to clear Salvianus and his ordainer Felix of charges, proving their communion was justified. In contrast, their opponents were treditors or descendants of treditors. Over time, the Church's defenders argued it was impossible for the Catholic Church to have vanished worldwide, and survived only in Donatus's region, limited to a few Africans. Once this was proven, it was established that baptism and other sacraments conferred by Catholics were valid and effective. Augustine, and to some extent Optatus before him, argued that baptism would be valid even if performed by schismatics or heretics. Therefore, the Donatists sinned doubly by rebaptizing those baptized by Catholics. First, by rejecting the true Church's baptism, and second, by repeating legitimate baptism regardless of who performed it. The Council of Donatists opposed repeated baptism. Not all Donatists agreed on rebaptism. Tertullian the Donatist, as Augustine reports, had a different view. To Vincent the Rogatist, number 43, a council of 270 bishops of the Donatist communion was held in Carthage. For 75 days, all past issues were set aside, and it was decreed that those guilty of the immense crime of being traditors, if they did not want to be baptized, should be treated as full members. Tertullian, the bishop of Macrianense, of the same communion, integrated the treditors into the church. According to the council's decisions, he made unity with the treditors. Donatus continually communicated with Tertullian after this act. He communicated not only with Tertullian but also with all the bishops of Manor who, for 40 years up to the persecution by Macarius, communicated with the treditors without baptism. There is no other trace of that council, which seems to have been held not before the year 330, not at the beginning of the schism. This is proven first by the large number of bishops at this council, indicating that the Donatist faction was confirmed and widely spread in Africa at that time. Secondly, Tertullian notes that when he wrote about these events, many eyewitnesses were still alive who could confirm their certainty and evidence. Tertullian flourished around the year 380, so this must have happened many years after the beginning of the schism. Thirdly, it indicates that Donatus was then the bishop of Carthage. After stating that Tertullian, according to the council's decisions, made unity with the treditors, he adds that Donatus continually communicated with Tertullian after this act. Therefore, it was during the time of Donatus of Carthage, under whom the Donatist faction especially flourished, that this council was held around the year 330. Augustine asserts that Tertullian's testimony about that council is true because Parmenion, writing back against him, did not refute these claims. Tertullian mentions that many were still alive when he wrote these things, who could confirm their certainty and evidence. Nevertheless, Donatus and other Donatists, ignoring the council's authority, presumed to baptize again those who had been baptized by Catholics. At the same time, or even a few years earlier, the Donatists, wanting to establish a presence in Rome, secretly sent bishops from Africa to govern a few errant and wandering individuals, especially Africans living in Rome at that time. The first of these was Victor, bishop of Garba in Numidia, who appears to have been the same person who participated in the Council of Cirta. When he came to Rome, as Optatus says, he was a son without a father, a novice without a leader, a disciple without a teacher, a follower without a predecessor, a lodger without a home, a guest without a lodging, a shepherd without a flock, a bishop without a people. The few individuals among the more than 40 basilicas in Rome at that time did not have a place to gather, so they could not be called a flock or a people. They fenced off a certain cave outside the city with wicker screens to create a meeting place, and hence, were called Montenses, Campidi, or Rupidi in Rome. He was succeeded by Boniface, bishop of Belida in Numidia, also sent from Africa to Rome. Augustine mentions these two in his book on the one baptism against Petilianus, stating that the Donatists initially sent these agents from afar to the Africans in Rome. Since they were bishops of other sees in Africa and not ordained under the title of the Roman see, they could not be called Roman bishops but only agents, as the ancients preferred to say. Eventually, they deceived the common people in Rome, and ordained them as if they were their own bishops. The first among these was Encolpius, about whom nothing is known. Macrobius succeeded him. He was initially a priest of the Catholic Church in Africa, and wrote a book for confessors and virgins. This book contained essential moral teachings, and was particularly focused on maintaining chastity with very fitting sayings. After leaving the Catholic Church, he became a secret bishop of the Donatists in Rome, as noted by Gennadius. Macrobius was still alive and living in Rome when Optatus first wrote around the year 370. Lucian succeeded Macrobius, followed by Claudian. Claudian was living in Rome after 380. As recorded in the letter of the bishops of Italy to Emperors Gratian and Valentinian, They wrote about the Donatists and Claudian with these words: Your clemency ordered a man named Restitutus to plead his case before the bishops throughout Africa. He was supposed to comply, but he fled due to the violent and arrogant actions of some men. Again, you commanded that the sacrilegious rebaptizers be expelled from Africa by the will of God. However, Claudian was ordained by those who were expelled, and was sent as a supposed bishop to disturb Rome. He, against the divine scriptures and the laws of the gospel, declared that all bishops, past or present, were void of mysteries and, to use his words, were pagans. Your tranquility ordered him to be expelled from Rome and to return to his own country. However, disregarding these judgments and often being restrained, he still resides there, frequently bribing the poor and daring to rebaptize the redeemed. He deprives them more of what they had received than he gives, as it is evident that what was conferred cannot be given twice. According to their report, Gratian wrote the following about Claudianus to Aquilinus, the city's vicar. Claudianus, called upon by those who restore the faults of religion against divine commandments, by those, I say, whom we had ordered to be expelled, as if he had not committed enough crime if he had persisted in Africa, is said to have introduced himself in Rome, the false teacher either striving to profane those still uninitiated with a deviant mystery, or, having already been initiated, strives to corrupt anew with a greater scandal. Since the repetition does not enhance the discipline of the most holy religion, but overturns it, we, pursuing this Claudianus with a punishment different from what he deserved, ordered him merely to return to his homeland, avoiding severe measures for the time being. But now he is said to still reside there, inciting the uninformed and seeking entirely worthless rewards, destroying the souls of the redeemed. Who succeeded Claudianus is uncertain. However, Felix participated in the Carthaginian conference. He claimed to be the bishop of the city of Rome and signed the Donatists' mandate, as recorded in the Acts of the Conference on Day 1, Chapter 149. When his name was read out and he came forward, Aurelius, bishop of the Catholic Church of Carthage, protested, even though he claims to be the bishop of the city of Rome, why is Innocentius, the true bishop of Rome, prejudged in his absence? It is likely that he was Roman, for Petilianus immediately said, no one is unaware of the reason that brought him here. All nobility here is Roman, and you yourselves know this. The same storm and necessity, specifically the calamity of the Roman city which Alaric captured on August 24, 410, brought him here. With this Felix, it seems the succession of the pseudo-bishops of the Roman Donatist faction ended. Donatists not only sent bishops to Rome but also to Spain, to the house of a certain woman, sending an imaginary bishop, as Augustine testifies. They left nothing undone, traveling over seas and lands to add converts to their sect. Their sect, however, remained within Africa and was quite numerous for a while. It also existed in a few places in Rome, particularly among the Montenses and in the house or property of a single Spanish woman. The Donatists were invited to unity in various ways. After the death of Constantine, Africa fell to Constans. When the Donatist faction stirred up new riots there, the emperor, with Sicilian urging it, Leontius the count agreeing, Ursatius the leader, and Marcellinus then the tribune, made efforts to bring the Donatists back to Catholic unity. They were offered the chance to unite with the Catholic Church and retain their ecclesiastical honors. They were enticed with rewards and various temptations for their salvation. But since their spirit remained rigid and inflexible in schism, and they daily plotted new actions against the Catholic Church, they were suppressed with the help of secular power. Leontius and Ursatius acted harshly against some of the more turbulent ones, seizing some basilicas they had occupied, which could not be done without force. Some were thrown into prison, others were exiled and banished. Although these punishments were due to their own crimes, they nevertheless seized the opportunity to slander the Catholics, accusing them of being persecutors and enemies of Christians who cruelly raged against the innocent. These and other things can be seen in the speech of a certain Donatist, which we publish for the first time. Gregory succeeded Ursatius and Leontius, who are recorded as the first to suppress the Donatists by force of arms. Donatus wrote such insulting letters to him, calling him a stain on the Senate and a disgrace to the prefects, attacking him with other such reproaches. Gratus succeeded Cecilian. Paul and Macarius were sent to Africa, and were the cause of the Circumcelliones' rage. After the death of Cecilian of Carthage before the year 347, Gratus succeeded him and was present at the Council of Sardica that year among the Catholic bishops. At that time, Donatus of Carthage was still alive. Athanasius's opponents from the Pseudo-Sardican Synod wrote to him. The Donatists later boasted about this letter to prove they had once been in communion with the Eastern churches. During the time of Gratus, the bishop of Carthage, and perhaps at his request, Emperor Constans sent Paul and Macarius to Africa in 348. Their primary mission was not to create unity but to distribute alms from the treasury to the poor. When they met Donatus and explained their mission, Donatus, in his usual rage, burst out with these words, according to Optatus, "What does the emperor have to do with the church? He then poured out many insults from his fountain of levity. The emperor had sent decorations for the houses of God and alms for the poor, but nothing for Donatus. So why did he rage? Why was he angry? Why did he reject what had been sent? When Paul and Macarius explained that they were traveling through each province to give to those willing to receive, Donatus said he had sent letters everywhere to ensure that the alms would not be distributed to the poor anywhere. Nevertheless, Paul and Macarius traveled through the provinces, distributing alms among the people and encouraging unity. When they reached the city of Bagae in Numidia, another Donatus, the bishop of that city, sought to oppose unity and block their efforts. He sent messengers to the neighboring areas and markets, stirring up a large crowd of furious people known as the Circumcellions. Augustine described them as a rustic and notoriously bold group, committing great crimes not only against others but also against themselves with the same insane ferocity. They considered it glorious and close to martyrdom to bring about their own death by precipice, fire, and water. Donatus called them agonistics, as if they were fighting for truth and justice, though in reality, they were seizing others' property unlawfully and savagely attacking others. Before Paul and Macarius arrived, a group led by Exito and Phaar, who were called leaders of the saints by some, caused widespread fear and chaos. As Optatus recounts in his third book, section 4, the power of debt notes was rendered useless. Creditors couldn't demand payment, and everyone was terrified by the letters from these self-proclaimed leaders of the saints. If anyone delayed in following their orders, a frenzied crowd would suddenly appear. Fear gripped creditors, driving them to beg for their lives instead of asking for their debts to be paid. People were quick to forego even the largest debts, considering it a blessing to escape harm. Even the roads were unsafe, as masters were thrown from their vehicles by their slaves, who then took their places. The roles of masters and slaves were reversed by the command of these so-called leaders. The bishops of this faction, feeling threatened, wrote to Count Tertullian. They believed that these men couldn't be corrected within the church and needed to be disciplined by the count. In response, Tertullian sent armed soldiers to patrol the markets, where the Circumcellions often caused trouble. Many were killed or mutilated in the Octavian place, and their bodies were displayed on whitewashed altars or tables. Some began to be buried in basilicas, but the priest Clarus in the Sibulian place was forced by his bishop to conduct an unburied burial, revealing that there was an order against such burials in the house of God. Their numbers grew stronger, and Donatus of Bagae led a furious crowd against Macarius. From this group, some sought false martyrdom and even hired assassins to bring about their own destruction. Therefore, even those who, from the peaks of high mountains, threw away their worthless lives, hurled themselves headlong. Look, from what kind of group another bishop, Donatus, had made his cohorts. Frightened by this fear, those who carried treasures to distribute to the poor found a solution in such a great necessity. They asked Count Sylvester for armed soldiers, not to harm anyone, but to prevent the violence arranged by the aforementioned bishop Donatus. By this reasoning, it came to pass that armed soldiers were seen. Now, whatever followed, see to whom it should or could be attributed. There was an enormous crowd of those summoned there, and it is known that enough provisions had been prepared. They had made the basilica into a kind of public granary, waiting for those upon whom they could vent their fury. They would have done whatever their madness dictated, had the presence of armed soldiers not opposed them. Before the soldiers arrived, quartermasters were sent as usual, but they were not appropriately received, contrary to the apostles' precepts, who says, "To whom honor, honor; to whom tax, tax; to whom tribute, tribute; owe no one anything." Romans chapter 13, 7-8. Those who were sent were beaten along with their horses, by those whose names Parmenianus fanned with the fan of envy. They themselves caused their injury, and taught what they could suffer by first committing injuries. The vexed soldiers returned to their ranks, and what 2 or 3 had suffered, all mourned. Everyone was agitated. The commanders could not restrain the angry soldiers. Thus it happened that an action was taken through which envy was directed at unity. The audacity of the Circumcellions was suppressed by force. Indeed, and some were killed, including Marculus, Donatus of Bagae, Maximianus, and Isaac. The Donatists celebrated their memory as if they were martyrs and wrote down their acts of suffering, which we have published at the end of this work. However, many schismatic bishops with their clergy fled in fear. Some died. Those who were stronger were captured and exiled far away. It seems that Donatus of Carthage was one of those individuals, as Petilianus referred to him in the Carthaginian conference as a man of martyrial glory. These events primarily took place in Numidia, while the proconsular province remained free from these disturbances. During the time of Macarius, the Donatists grew resentful towards the Catholics. Optatus stated that none of these actions were approved, advised, or carried out by the Catholics. Instead, everything was done in sorrow, with God weeping bitterly, and in defiance of the sacred baptism, which they were once again attempting to oppose. Nevertheless, this led to unity and the restoration of peace in Africa. Gratus of Carthage, the bishop at the Carthaginian Council in 349, expressed gratitude to God on behalf of all the Catholic bishops of Africa. He said, "Thanks to Almighty God and Jesus Christ, who put an end to evil schisms and brought his church together, raising all its scattered members." He commanded the most religious Emperor Constantius to vow for unity, and to send the ministers of the Holy Work, servants of God, Paul, and Macarius. 2 canons on Donatists. In the same council, 2 canons were established regarding the Donatists. One decreed that rebaptisms were illegal for those who had been baptized in the name of the Trinity according to the Gospel and the Apostles' doctrine. The other stated that men who had committed suicide or deserved to be killed should not be venerated as martyrs. Slander against Macarius about placing an image on the altar. During this period, Optatus mentioned that the Donatists spread a rumor that Paul and Macarius would participate in the sacrifice. They claimed that when the altars were solemnly prepared, they would bring forth an image, place it on the altar, and offer the sacrifice. When this news reached their ears, their hearts were struck, and each person was moved to say these words, so that everyone who heard this would say, "Whoever tastes from there, tastes from the sacred." And it was rightly said, if such fame was followed by similar truth. But when they arrived, nothing was seen that matched the earlier false rumors. The Christian eyes saw nothing to dread. Nothing was confirmed by sight among those things which had disturbed their hearing. Purity was seen, and the customary solemn ritual was observed. When they witnessed the divine sacrifices, nothing was changed, added, or taken away. Peace commended by God pleased the willing. Therefore, none of them should be blamed who transitioned to peace from the Donatist group. Those disturbed by false opinion were strengthened by simple and pure truth. Driven from this slander, the Donatists fled to another, saying, Macarius should not have been admitted to communion by the bishops, much less allowed to address the people in the church, which seemed to be the bishop's sole privilege. To which Optatus responds, Macarius communicated with the bishops as a layman, not as a bishop, and addressed the people in the church, but only to convey some matter, not to conduct, that is, preach, which is for bishops. Nor did he greet the people in the manner of bishops at the beginning of prayer in the name of God, nor did he perform any priestly duty. The peace of the African church lasted for as long as it did. Donatus died in exile. Parmenianus succeeded Donatus. The unity and peace of the African church, procured by Macarius, lasted for almost 14 years under Constans and Constantius. At that time, Vitellius Afer seems to have composed a book on this topic, arguing that the servants of God are hated by the world, in which he attacked the Catholics as persecutors, and presented his own as servants of God unjustly suffering persecution. He also wrote another work, in which he once again inserted the old slander of the crime of tradition against the Catholics. Donatus of Carthage is believed to have died in exile before the reign of Emperor Julian. This is inferred from Optatus, who in Book 3 Section 3 says that what was said by the prophet about the ruler of Tyre was fulfilled in him, that he would die in a land not his own. This was well known to have happened to Donatus. Donatus was succeeded by Parmenianus after the year 350, possibly in the year 355, which is when Jerome mentions him in the Chronicle. He is the one Optatus refuted, and about whom much has already been said in the preface of this work. Meanwhile, in the Catholic seat, Gratus was succeeded by Restitutus, who participated in the Council of Ariminum in the year 359. Restitutus was succeeded by Genethlius, who lived until the year 390. Status of the African Church after the restoration of unity. Optatus correctly describes the state of the African Church after the restoration of unity in Book 2 Section 15. He says that when peace united the African, Eastern and other overseas peoples, and when unity brought together all the members to form the body of the Church, the devil was pained by this, as he is always troubled by the peace of brothers. At that time, under a Christian emperor, the devil was abandoned in idols as if imprisoned, lying in temples. At this same time, the leaders and princes of the Donatists had been exiled due to their own merits. There were no schisms in the church, nor was it allowed for pagans to practice sacrilege. A peace pleasing to God resided among all Christian peoples. The devil mourned in temples, and the Donatists in foreign lands. Freedom restored to the Donatists by Julian. But after Constantius died on November 3, 361, the Donatists presented a petition to Emperor Julian, asking for the return of the basilicas that they complained had been taken away from them, and to regain their former freedom. The petition was presented in the name of Rogationus, Pontius, Cassian, and other bishops and clerics of the Donatist faction. In it they did not hesitate to flatter Julian servilely, saying that only justice had access to him. The apostate emperor, wishing to destroy the Christian religion by any means, readily granted their requests, knowing it would greatly harm the African Church. He ordered the return of those he knew would come with fury to disturb the peace. He repealed the laws against the Donatists and granted them all freedom, or rather license, to undertake anything. Therefore, with the same decree that opened the temples of idols, the Donatists were given freedom. The returning bishops, including Parmenianus, bishop of Carthage, presented their petitions and the emperor's rescript to the magistrates. Armed with this, they dared everything against the Catholics. Optatus describes their crimes of that time in Book 2, Section 17. At almost the same moments he says, "Your fury returns to Africa, just as the devil is released from his chains, and you are not ashamed. You who share common joy with the enemy at the same time. You came rabid, you came angry, tearing apart the members of the church, subtle in seductions, fierce in murders, provoking the sons of peace to war. You made many exiles from their seats, coming with a hired hand and invading basilicas. Many among your number committed bloody murders in many places. Too numerous to name, such were the atrocities that reports had to be sent to the judges of that time. Numerous crimes and sacrileges were committed by the Donatists, which Optatus describes extensively in the same book, and also in Book 6, where you can read about them. The laws of the emperors concerning the Donatists. Julian, who was removed on June 26, 363, was succeeded by Jovian, who died shortly after and could not establish anything regarding the African Church. But Valentinian I restrained the Donatists with severe laws, one of which, given on February 20, 373, at Trier, declared that a bishop who rebaptized was unworthy of the priesthood. At the same time, the Roman count who commanded the forces in Africa until the year 373, did not allow the schismatics to act freely as they wished, since the Donatists considered him one of their persecutors at the Carthaginian conference. Following this, on October 17, 377, Gratian passed a severe law against them. The Donatists were divided into many sects. Around this time, the sect of Donatus splintered into numerous factions. Disputes between Tychonius and Parmenianus over the church and rebaptism led to the rise of many factions among the Donatists in Mauritania and Numidia. Augustine notes that some of these groups were not well known, such as the Urbanenses in a certain corner of Numidia and the Claudianists, who later reconciled with Premianus, Parmenianus's successor. Augustine more frequently mentions the Rogatists and Maximianists, whose histories are better known. The schism of the Rogatists was led by Rogatus, a Moorish bishop, possibly from Cartina. As a result, they were scattered in small numbers throughout Mauritania Caesarensis. The reason for their secession from the other Donatists remains uncertain. They were milder than other factions and did not use the Circumcellian groups. However, it is recorded that Rogatus, with fierce persistence, engaged in legal disputes over some unknown matters involving his followers. They claimed that when Christ came to judgment, he would find faith only among them, which led to their being disliked by both Donatists and Catholics. Consequently, the rest of the Donatist body could hardly tolerate this faction and incited secular rulers against them. During the reign of Valentinian and Valens, Firmus, a Moor and son of Nubal, king of Mauritania, secretly killed his brother Zama. This made him an enemy of Romanus, the Roman count of Africa who favored Zama. Fearing condemnation and death, Firmus rebelled against the empire and seized control of the kingdom of Mauritania. Taking advantage of the opportunity, the Donatists, through the barbarian king Rogatus and his followers, severely and bitterly harassed the people of Mauritania Caesarensis. They did everything they could to force them to return to their fold, or to satisfy their cruelty with vengeance. This persecution continued until Theodosius the Elder was sent to Africa by Valentinian, with the army to confront Firmus, a rebel against the empire. After defeating Firmus in several battles, Theodosius forced him to end his life by hanging. Rogatus, who outlived Firmus, remained in schism. During that time, the bishop of the Rogatists in Caesarensis made a pact for the safety of his people with the tyrant Firmus and opened the gates to him, thus leading to the devastation of the city, affecting not only the Catholics but the entire population. After Rogatus died, Vincentius succeeded him in both his position and his schism. There was also another Vincentius Victor of the same sect, a disciple and follower of the former Vincentius, who, although he had returned to Catholic unity, had not entirely abandoned his former veneration of Vincentius. He even boasted that Vincentius had appeared to him and helped him complete a work he published against Augustine concerning the soul and its origin. The schism of the Maximianists began shortly after the year 391, when Premianus was ordained as the bishop of Carthage, replacing Parmenianus on the side of Donatus. Around the same time, Aurelius succeeded Genethlius among the Catholics. Newly ordained Premianus decided to condemn Maximian, a deacon of his church who was said to be a relative of Donatus, and whom he felt had insulted him with his arrogance. Along with 3 other deacons, Rogatianus, Donatus, and Salgamius, he passed judgment on Maximian in his absence. Maximian, relying on the wealth of a certain woman, just as Majorinus once relied on the influence of Lucilla, opposed Premian. He gathered part of the Carthaginian people and some elders to his side, and in their name, sent letters and envoys to the entire assembly of bishops, asking them to come to Carthage. Maximian himself approached the neighboring bishops, explained his innocence to them, stirred up envy against Premian, and then accused him before them. When these 43 bishops came to Carthage, Premian refused to meet with them. He gathered a crowd, secured officials, and blocked the basilica doors, preventing the bishops who came against him from entering and conducting their ceremonies. Summoned to their council once, twice, and 3 times, he refused to attend and mistreated those sent by the council. The bishops, not daring to pass final judgment on him in his absence at that time, advised, as Augustine says in Book 4 against Cresconius, Chapter 6, that Premian, if he trusted his cause, should be given the opportunity to respond and clear himself at the next more notable council. This council, held shortly after at Cabarchusi in Byzacania, was larger than the previous one, with 100 bishops if Augustine is to be believed, although only 53 names appear in the subscription of the letter of this council. In that council, a final decision was made against Premianus with these words: "We have decreed, with all the priests of God present, and the Holy Spirit among us, that this same Premianus, first because he replaced living bishops with others, because he mixed the impure with the communion of saints, because he tried to force presbyters into making an oath, because he had presbyter Fortunatus thrown out into a sewer when he was helping the sick with baptism, because he denied communion to presbyter Demetrius to force him to disown his son, because that same presbyter was scolded for hosting bishops, because the aforementioned Premianus sent a crowd to destroy Christian homes, because bishops and clerics were besieged and then stoned by his followers, because elders were killed in the basilica, because they indignantly allowed Claudianists into communion, because he thought innocent clerics should be condemned, because he refused to listen to us, blocking the doors of the basilicas with a crowd and officials so we couldn't enter, because he insultingly rejected the envoys we sent to him, because he first took many places by force and then by judicial authority, besides other unlawful acts of his that we have remained silent about for the sake of the dignity of our writing, he is to be condemned by the priestly choir forever, so that by coddling him, the Church of God is not stained by contagion or any crime. It has indeed pleased us and the Holy Spirit that time for conversion be reserved for those who are slow to convert under these terms, that any of our fellow priests or clerics who, from the day of the condemnation of the aforementioned Premianus, which is June 24th until January 16th, have not separated themselves from the communion of the condemned Premianus, be bound by this sentence. Lay people also, unless they separate themselves from his company from the aforementioned day of his condemnation by Easter of the coming year, cannot be reformed to the Church except through penance, provided they remember. From this, we learn that this council was held on June 24, 393, because the Council of Bagae, where its acts were repealed, was held in the year 394. After Premianus was deposed, the same bishops appointed Maximianus as bishop of Carthage in his place. He was ordained by 12 bishops shortly after, against Premianus, just as Majorinus was once ordained against Caecilianus. The Council of Bagae opposed Maximianus and his followers, leading to the persecution of the Maximianists by the followers of Premianus. Despite their efforts to protect themselves, Premianus believed that a larger council needed to be assembled to address the case of Maximianus. It was held in Bagae in Numidia on April 24, 394. 310 bishops were present. There, not only was Maximianus acquitted, but he and his ordainers, along with the clergy of the Church of Carthage who had participated in his ordination, were condemned. The others who had followed Maximianus were given until December 25 to return. If they did not comply by then, a sentence was pronounced against them, so that they could not be admitted after the set date except through repentance and consequently losing their honors. The author of this sentence, which we have almost entirely referred to from various places in St. Augustine's writings among the old monuments, was Emeritus, Bishop of Caesarea. When this was announced in the council, everyone joyfully acclaimed it, partly pleased that it was so eloquent, partly because it significantly insulted their schismatics. After it was published with everyone's consent, they immediately began to prosecute the condemned with great zeal. They turned to Maximianus' basilica, which they called not a basilica but a cave, and with their stirred-up crowd, they took care to overturn it. Not content with this, Premianus, with the support of a priest sent from Carthage, drove Maximianus out of his own house, ordering it to be converted into an ecclesiastical exorcism place. Many who initially followed Maximian, frightened by the circumstances, eventually returned to their former companions and were welcomed back as if they were cleansed and innocent. However, some stubbornly remained resolute and could not be convinced to return to Premian. These individuals sought the protection of the proconsuls, who despite being appointed by Christian emperors, were still pagans. The decree of Bagae was presented to them, citing laws against heretics that ordered their expulsion from the basilicas. Official orders were obtained, requesting the assistance of local authorities to enforce these decrees. Consequently, those condemned by the Council of Bagae and who attended their own congregations, were expelled from the places and basilicas they had long held. Some complied easily and did not suffer much, but those who resisted faced severe affliction. Those who were not strong enough were defeated and expelled, with others appointed in their place. Let's look at the actions taken by the Premianists against Salvius of Membresa, Felician of Musti, and Pretextatus of Asurus. The Maximianist leaders condemned by the Council of Bagae faced particular persecution, especially Salvius, the bishop of Membresa. In 394, Restitutus was ordained by the Premianists to replace him. Nemesius, advocating for Restitutus, brought the case to Herod the proconsul, requesting that the Membresitan church be handed over to the Premianist communion. He argued that Salvius, condemned by the decree of the plenary council of Bagae, should cede all his positions as bishop to Restitutus or return to Premian. This was the proconsul's judgment. Felician of Musti and Pretextatus of Asurus, also leaders among the Maximians, faced similar accusations. Titian spoke against Felician on March 2, 395, reiterating the same points Nemesius had made against Salvius. Proconsul Herodes, who had already ruled against Salvius and Pretextatus, also condemned Felicianus and ordered that the churches taken from the Maximianists be handed over to the bishops of the Premianists. Nonetheless, Felicianus and Pretextatus kept their churches, despite Regatus, who later converted to the Catholic faith, being ordained as the bishop of the Premianists. The Donatist army, specifically the band of Circumcellions, cut off his tongue and hands. In vain the Premianists went to Proconsul Theodorus and the magistrates the following year. They stayed in their positions until, worn down by misfortunes, they returned to unity with Premianus. But Salvius of Membresa, once again summoned before Proconsul Serenus, defended his case in court. Augustine suggests this might be because he knew his opponents couldn't use the laws against heretics before the judge without also implicating themselves. Before Proconsul Serenus, either favor held more sway, or perhaps the council at Bagae, which was also cited against Salvius. Thus he said, "The lawsuit of the bishops must be heard by bishops according to the law. The bishops have judged, why do you not return to the course of antiquity under satisfaction? Or, as you have written, you expose your backs to persecutors." When Salvius refused to comply with the proconsul's advice, the proconsul ordered him to be expelled from his church. Since he tried to retain his seat with the support of those from Membresa who favored him, the neighbors from Abatina were ordered to execute the judgment against him. Captured by them, Salvius was not only expelled from his church, but was also mocked in a miserable display. The old man, as Augustine reports in Book 4 against Cresconius, from which almost this entire narrative is taken, had dead dogs tied around his neck, and they danced around with him as much as they pleased. This inhumane act is comparable to the Etruscan kings who attached dead bodies to the living. Indeed, it is even more shameful because dead dogs are more repulsive than dead humans. To such an extent that if Salvius, an old man and bishop, had to choose between two supplications, he would have much preferred to linger among human corpses than to dance with dogs. Meanwhile, Salvius could endure being deprived of his church and his seat and all these sufferings, yet he still did not wish to return to communion with Premianus. So he acted with his followers, upheld the justice he claimed to suffer for, convinced himself he was holy because he had suffered, and deemed his adversaries most unjust because they had caused his suffering. Eventually, they built him another basilica at Membresa. While he was seated there, he was harassed by his new adversary Restitutus, and they clashed over cells and small plots of land in a noisy and contentious legal battle. Thus, the followers of Premianus litigated against Maximianus and those who had been condemned in the Council of Bagae before 4 or more proconsuls in the forum through their advocates. The tyranny of Gildo. After Theodosius died on January 16, 395, a few months later, Gildo, the count, and master of both military branches in Africa since 386, seized tyranny, and took control of all Africa. Among others, Optatus of Thamogati, a bishop in Numidia called a follower of Gildo because he was part of Gildo's entourage, had great influence with this barbarian and pagan man. This fierce man, similar to Gildo, was harsh not only to Catholics but to everyone. Accompanied by a military squad, he used to oppress widows, ruin the fortunes of orphans, tear wives from their husbands, force landowners to sell their possessions, and split the proceeds with them. In short, he rampaged against all with violence, plunder, and deceit. Despite his behavior, his followers held him in such high esteem that they dared not condemn him or even warn him. Amidst the many laments of Africa, they did not refuse him the kiss of peace, placed the Eucharist in his hands, and received it from him in return. Finally, after he perished in prison because he was part of Gildo's entourage, they celebrated Optatus' anniversary every year with great ceremony as if he were a martyr. Using the work of this man, the followers of Premianus severely harassed the Maximianists and the Rogatists, compelling many to return to Premianus. The citizens of Asurus and Musti had defended their bishops, Felicianus and Pretextatus, against the efforts of Premianus's followers up until this point. Optatus threatened them with severe punishments unless they abandoned the defense of their bishops and forced them to return to Premianus's communion. Fearing the soldiers of Optatus, the citizens complied. Felicianus and Pretextatus, unable to retain their positions otherwise, surrendered. A large assembly of bishops was held, attended by both Premianus and Optatus Guildanianus. In this assembly, the two bishops were accepted with their honor preserved and their positions retained. They were received by the followers of Premianus, and anyone baptized by them during the schism was accepted without a second baptism. Optatus also significantly harassed the Rogatists, but he especially raged against the Catholics, inciting the Circumcellians against them once more. The Catholics suffered countless troubles at their hands. The Circumcellians were now armed not only with clubs but also with various other weapons. They openly committed acts of violence, invaded and plundered basilicas, and killed or severely mistreated bishops and clerics, publicly committing robberies. To suppress these disturbances, with Gildo already removed, who, attacked by his brother Muscesel, deserted by his own men and ended his life by hanging at the beginning of the year 398, Emperor Honorius issued a law on April 25, 398. This law ordered that those who attacked Catholic churches, causing harm to priests, ministers or the place of worship, should be arrested, and, if convicted, subjected to capital punishment. He also decreed that it should be permissible for everyone to pursue grievous injuries done to priests or ministers as a public crime. If a violent group defended itself with arms, or took advantage of difficult locations, he commanded judges to request armed assistance from the Count of Africa so that the perpetrators of such crimes would not escape. The decrees of the councils on promoting or leaving the Donatists in the clergy. In the meantime, the Catholics tried everything to invite the Donatists to concord. At the beginning of the schism, bishops and clerics returning to the church from the Donatist side were received with their honors. However, as their number and stubbornness grew, subsequent councils decreed that no Donatist should be received into the church with their honor, but only as a layperson. At the Council of Hippo in the year 393, it was proposed that those who either had not rebaptized or who wished to transfer to Catholic communion with their congregations be exempted from this law. However, it was decided that this exception should not be confirmed until the overseas church had been consulted. Again, at the Council of Carthage in the year 397, it was mandated to consult Siricius, the bishop of Rome, and Simplicianus, the bishop of Milan, on whether infants baptized by the Donatists, when they returned to the Church of God with a good resolution, could be promoted to the ministry of the sacred altar. The bishops of Rome and Milan responded that it was prohibited. Nevertheless, the African bishops, due to the lack of clerics and the needs of their churches, which were so deserted that many churches did not even have a deacon or an illiterate person, were compelled to decree that children baptized among the Donatists before they had the use of reason, who later, upon recognizing the truth, came to the Church of God and were received through the laying on of hands, could be promoted to the clergy. To ensure that this decree was agreeable to the overseas bishops, they sent a solemn delegation to Anastasius, the bishop of Rome, and Venerius, the bishop of Milan, from the Council of Carthage held in the year 401, in the month of June. They also added what they had previously proposed, that some Donatist clerics who wished to transfer with their honors and congregations could be received, but they did not dare to press this point. The bishops from overseas agreed with the Africans that they should fully support promoting children baptized among the Donatists to the clergy. It's not clear how Anastasius responded to this, but in the Council of Carthage held in September of the same year, it's recorded that in his letter, he encouraged the African bishops with fatherly and brotherly concern not to ignore the injuries caused by heretics and schismatics who were troubling the African church. It seems likely that he allowed children baptized among the Donatists to be promoted to the orders, as the Africans didn't ask anything more about this matter from the Apostolic See. However, regarding the reception of Donatists with their honors, they decided to send letters to the brothers and fellow bishops, and especially to the Apostolic See where Anastasius presides. This was to make it known that Africa has a great need for the Church's peace and benefit, and that any clerics among the Donatists who wish to join the Catholic unity with a corrected mind may be received with their honors according to the will and counsel of the respective Catholic bishop governing the Church in that place, if it seems to benefit Christian peace. They added that this was done in earlier times during the same division. They did not request or establish that the decree of the council held regarding this matter in overseas parts be dissolved. The condition remains for those whose return would not bring a great gain of souls, meaning they should not be received with their honors according to the decree of the overseas council. However, those who contribute to Catholic unity are exempt from this. In the same African council, the Catholic bishops decided that letters should be sent to African judges, requesting them to investigate thoroughly and with judicial authority what has happened in all places where the Maximianists have taken over churches. The Maximianists had made a schism, and the bishops wanted these actions recorded in public records for everyone's knowledge. The bishops also agreed to send envoys for preaching peace and unity, essential for Christian salvation, to to the bishops and congregations of the Donatists. This was to show everyone that the Donatists had no grounds against the Catholic Church. It would be made clear through municipal records how the Donatists had condemned the Maximianists in their plenary council of 18, yet later accepted them back along with their baptisms. This would highlight the inconsistency in their resistance to the Church's peace. Meanwhile, they argued that we, the Catholic Church, were defiled by our communion, even though they couldn't prove their accusations. The vigilant bishops of the Donatists were striving to recall them from schism and bring them back into the Church. From the writings and actions of St. Augustine against the Donatists. Alphabetical Psalm. Now it's time to speak about the writings and conflicts of St. Augustine against the Donatists, which ultimately led to their defeat. When Augustine was promoted to the rank of presbyter in the Church of Hippo in the year 391, he composed an alphabetical psalm. This psalm was designed to be easily understood by the less educated, so that even the humblest and most ignorant people could comprehend the cause of the Donatists and remember it. In it, he explained the entire history of the schism, and offered a brief refutation in a humble and straightforward manner. He places this work in his retractations after another work on faith and the Creed, which he composed at the Council of Hippo in the year 393. He also refers to the book against the letter of Donatus, which he wrote as the second in his time, noting that Majorinus was bishop at the same presbytery. In this letter, Donatus argued that the baptism of Christ should be believed to exist only in his communion. There's also his letter, number 23, to Maximinus, a Donatist bishop of the town of Sanete, who was said to have rebaptized a Catholic from the Church of Mutugina and made him a deacon. In this letter, he urges Maximinus to either admit the deed and defend it with whatever documents he can, or if he denies it, and believes rebaptism to be unnecessary, to publicly state this and return to the Church. Finally, he invites him either to a discussion or to write back so that the unity of the Church may be established. That bishop later embraced Catholic peace after a journey overseas, and remained in the same see, as we learned from Augustine's letter 105. After Augustine became bishop, he did not cease to challenge the Donatists with writings, letters, sermons, and discussions. At the beginning of his episcopate, he invited Petilianus, an elderly bishop of the Donatist faction in Hippo and thus his adversary, to a discussion through letters. Petilianus initially pretended not to refuse the discussion, provided that 10 serious and honorable men from each side were present. But, changing his mind, he questioned why Augustine did not go to Constantine, where more of his people were, or suggested that he should go to Milevis where they were about to hold a council, indicating that he felt unequal to Augustine. In other letters sent to Eusebius, another Donatist bishop, Augustine criticized Petilianus for accepting a young man who had a history of beating his mother, and had even threatened to kill her after joining the Donatist sect. Petilianus received and rebaptized this young man while his mother was still suffering from her injuries. Augustine once again invites Petilianus to a discussion, and suggests that if he feels unprepared, he can seek assistance from any of his colleagues. Augustine states, "I do not understand why this man, who calls himself a bishop of many years, would fear discussing matters with me, a novice. If it concerns the knowledge of liberal arts, which he might not have learned or learned less, what does this have to do with the question that needs to be discussed from the Holy Scriptures or ecclesiastical or public documents? He has been involved in these matters for many years and should be more skilled than I am. Lastly, there is my brother and colleague, Samfucius of the Tourist Church, who has not learned such things that this man is said to fear. Let him be present and act together with him." He also sent a third letter on this matter to the same Eusebius, reminding Petilianus, who had already been warned about the young man who killed his mother, to exclude him from communion. Augustine adds that a certain subdeacon from the Spanish Church, named Primus, was removed from the clergy for inappropriate behavior towards nuns. In his anger against this discipline, Primus joined the Donatists and was rebaptized by them. 2 of his fellow nuns, either abducted from the estate of Catholic Christians or following him willingly, were also rebaptized, and now roam with the bands of circumcellions among wandering groups of women. Augustine wants this to be made known to Petilianus through Eusebius, so that Petilianus excludes him from communion, as Primus chose the Donatists only because he lost his clerical position in the Catholic Church, due to disobedience and corrupt behavior. He finally said that anyone who was demoted among the Donatists due to discipline and wanted to join the Catholic Church should be received in humble penance. The Donatists might have required the same if that person had wanted to stay with them. Augustine's letters mentioning these matters are now numbers 33, 34, and 35. Discussions of St. Augustine with the Donatists. There were discussions held by the Holy Doctor with the Donatists, one in the year 397 or the following year at Tiburzicum, with Fortunius, a Donatist bishop of that city, and other Donatists. For this, consult Augustine's letters 43 and 44. Another discussion was held through letters with another bishop of the same sect, named Honorius, and with Clarentius, also a bishop. The same would have been done with Crispinus of Calama, who was celebrated among his people for his age and reputation, if he had not prevented it. Augustine also urged his relative Severinus through a letter, which is now number 52, to leave the schism of the Donatists. Book against the party of Donatus. Books against the letter of Parmenion. Books on baptism. Around the same time, Augustine wrote 2 books titled Against the Party of Donatus. In the first book, he said he did not approve of using any secular power to forcibly compel the schismatics to communion. He mentioned that it did not please him at that time because he had not yet experienced how much harm their impunity could cause, or how much diligent discipline could contribute to changing them for the better. This work, elaborated by Augustine around the year 398 or 399, is still desired by us. The books against the letter of Parmenion to Tychonius, written around the year 400, should also be mentioned. In these books, he deals with and resolves the famous question of whether the bad contaminate the good in the unity and communion of the same sacraments. In the same work, he promises to discuss baptism more extensively, which he immediately fulfilled by publishing 7 books on baptism. The book against what Centurius brought from the Donatists. Around the same time, a layperson named Centurius brought some statements or writings from the Donatists to the church, using a few testimonies they thought supported their cause. In response, Augustine briefly wrote a booklet titled, Against What Centurius Brought from the Donatists. Unfortunately, this work no longer exists. 19 books against Petilianus. We have discussed Petilianus, the Donatist bishop of Constantine, elsewhere. When he wrote a letter against the Catholics to the Donatist priests and deacons, part of it was presented by the Catholics of that city to Fortunatus, the Catholic bishop of the same place, and Alypius of Tagaste, who then brought it to St. Augustine. Augustine immediately began to refute this fragment and completed his response in the first book. After intercepting the entire letter of Petilianus, he wrote a second book on it, while Anastasius was the Roman pontiff, or at least before Anastasius's death on April 27, 402. In this book, he addressed each word of Petilianus and added his own response. Before Augustine's response to part of the letter reached Petilianus, who attempted to respond, Augustine countered with a third book, the book on the unity of the Church. Before this response was published, Augustine seems to have written a letter to the Catholics, commonly called the Book on the Unity of the Church. At the beginning of this work, he mentions the first 2 books against Petilianus, not the third. Books against Cresconius. A Donatist grammarian named Cresconius found Augustine's first book against Petilianus and decided to respond, sending his reply to Augustine. In response, Augustine wrote 4 books, completing in 3 what the entire response demanded. But when he saw that the issue was solely about the case of the Maximianists, condemning their own schismatics and receiving some of them back into their honors without repeating the baptism given outside their communion, he added a 4th book. In this book, he carefully and clearly responded to everything that had been written. However, by the time he wrote these 4 books, Emperor Honorius had already issued laws against the Donatists. Augustine himself mentions this work in Book 2 of Retractations, indicating it was written after the year 406, as Honorius' laws were issued in 405. These are the books of proofs and testimonies against the Donatists. After this, to address the Donatists, Augustine says in the same place, I took care to gather necessary documents against their error and for Catholic truth, whether from ecclesiastical or public records, or from the canonical scriptures, and first sent the same promised documents to them so that they themselves might request them if possible. When these documents came into the hands of some of them, someone, whose name I do not know, wrote against them, confessing himself to be a Donatist, as if that were his name. In response, I wrote another book. I combined the promised documents with it and wanted them to be one, and thus I published it, so that it could be read on the walls of the basilica, which had previously been a Donatist place, with the title, Proofs and Testimonies Against the Donatists. The title of the other book I mentioned above was, Against an Unknown Donatist, a reminder to the Donatists about the Maximianists. These 2 books, which are now missing, were followed by a third, also lost, titled A Reminder to the Donatists About the Maximianists. This booklet was very brief so that it could easily be copied and reach many hands, and its brevity made it easier to remember. Book on the One Baptism. Before the conference in Carthage, a friend of Augustine received a book from a Donatist priest, Petilianus, about the one baptism, and brought it to Augustine, earnestly asking him to respond to it. Augustine fulfilled this request and titled his response book on the one baptism. This book still exists. It is one of the major works against the Donatists, in which Augustine demonstrated that their impious and arrogant error against the Catholic Church was completely overthrown by the case of the Maximianists alone. Catholics invite Donatists to a conference. While Augustine was privately working against the Donatists, the African bishops were striving to bring the Donatists to a conference, believing it was the only way to reconcile or overcome the schismatics. At the General Council of African Bishops held in Carthage on August 25, 403, it was decreed that the Donatists should be invited to a conference with selected bishops from both sides. They also obtained permission from Septiminius to meet with the Donatists and investigate the actions in the case of the Maximianists. As usual, the Donatists refused the conference. Then, Augustine wrote a letter to the lay people of the same sect, hoping they would perceive the dubious justice of their cause from the bishop's refusal. Donatists provoked by this invitation, delegates sent by Catholics to the emperor. The more the Donatists were invited to peace with kindness and persistence, the more ferociously they began to rage against the Catholics. An example of this is Crispinus, the bishop of Calama, who had great authority among his people and persecuted Petilianus, the Catholic bishop of the same city, so fiercely that Petilianus barely managed to escape to save his life. Because of these and other crimes, Crispinus was summoned to trial and accused of being a heretic. When he saw that a fine of 10 pounds of gold was imposed on him according to the Theodosian law of the year 392, he defended his case before the proconsul for 3 days, trying to clear himself of the charge of heresy. However, Petilianus proved in a public debate that the sentence pronounced under that name was just and lawful. Still, at Petilianus's request, the fine was remitted. Crispinus appealed to the emperor, who then imposed the same fine on him and the other Donatists. While this was happening, the Circumceliones violently attacked Maximianus of Bagae, who had reclaimed a basilica by law, and Servus of Tuber Sacober, who sought another. They, along with other bishops, clerics, and laypeople, were attacked so atrociously that the Fathers of the Council of Carthage, held in the year 404, decided on June 26 that Theseus and Evodius should be sent as envoys to the emperor to explain the enormous crimes committed by the Donatists against the Catholics, and to request protection for the Church. They also sought to have the law of Theodosius, which was enacted against the ordainers or ordained heretics, and those who possessed places where their congregation was found, confirmed and enforced against the Donatists. Similarly, they wanted another law, which denied heretics the right to benefit from donations or inheritances, to be reenacted. However, those who wished to correct themselves for the sake of unity and peace, should be allowed access to inheritance if something was given to them while they were still in heresy. Those who were sued, and thought they should convert to Catholicism were an exception, since it was believed that such people chose Catholic unity not out of fear of divine judgment, but out of a desire for earthly gain. This public delegation and the council's letters to the emperor included complaints from private individuals who had been wronged by the Donatists. An edict of unity was issued by Honorius. Unity achieved at Carthage. Moved by these events, Honorius issued a very strict edict against the Donatists, also known as the Rebaptizers, on February 12, in the year 405, during the consulships of Stilicho for the second time and Anthemius. 4 parts of this edict were issued on the same day in the Theodosian Code. It was called the Edict of Unity, as it commanded heretics and schismatics to return to the Catholic Church under the gravest penalties. The edict was sent to Pope Adrian of Italy and, specifically on March 5, to the proconsul of Africa for proclamation and enforcement there. By the power of this edict, unity was quickly achieved in Carthage, though it took longer in the other provinces of Africa. In a council held at Carthage on August 23 of the same year, it was decreed that, since unity had been achieved only in Carthage, letters should be sent to the judges, instructing them to work towards unity in other provinces and cities as well. Additionally, letters of thanksgiving from the Carthaginian Church should be sent to the imperial court on behalf of all Africa, for the exclusion of the Donatists, accompanied by letters from the bishops. 2 clerics were also sent to the court to give thanks and request the exclusion of the Donatists throughout Africa. Maximinus, a Donatist from Synoda, requested a meeting. On January 30, 406, Maximinus, the bishop of Synoda, along with some other Donatists, sought a public hearing in Ravenna before the prefect of the Praetorian Guard to present their case against the Catholics. The outcome is uncertain, but nothing substantial was done. Maximinus returned to Africa and joined the Catholic Church. Decree on Donatist bishops and episcopates. In June 407, at the Council of Carthage, it was decreed that congregations which had converted from Donatism and had their own bishops, should keep them without consulting the council. However, if their bishop had died and they did not have a successor, but wished to belong to the diocese of another bishop, this should not be denied to them. Regarding the bishops themselves, this decree states that those who joined the Catholic Church before the law on unity was passed by the emperor should keep their congregations and churches, but those who came to the church only after the edict was issued are to be stripped of their churches, and these churches and everything pertaining to them are to be assigned to the local Catholic bishops. Honorius laws regarding the Donatists. In the same year, Honorius passed a law granting immunity from all penalties incurred under the laws to heretics and schismatics who returned to the Church. In the year 408, after Stilicho was killed on August 23, new disturbances were stirred up by the Donatists, as if his death had freed them from the laws. To justify their audacity, they pretended that Honorius had granted them indulgence, but this pretense was immediately dispelled by laws issued by the emperor in the same and the following year. As the governors were diligently enforcing these laws, Augustine tried to divert the blood penalty from the rebellious schismatics. However, as imperial laws are often changeable, around the middle of the year 409, Honorius granted heretics the power to practice their superstition. But, at the request of the fathers of the Council of Carthage, who had sent a delegation of 5 bishops to the court, he revoked this liberty in the same year. He issued a very strict law against them, dated August 25, 410, to Heraclian, the Count of Africa. By this law, he entirely removed the oracle by which the followers of heretical superstition had intruded, and decreed that they should be punished with confiscation of property and blood, if they dared to meet publicly for their abominable crime. Edict on the convocation of bishops for a conference. Finally, since both sides had requested a conference, and the Catholics had earnestly demanded it, they sent representatives to Emperor Honorius. He issued an edict, sanctioned at Ravenna on October 14, under the consulship of Honorius, specifically in the year 410, commanding the Donatist and Catholic bishops to convene in the city of Carthage within 4 months. This was to allow selected priests from both sides to engage in discussions about their cause. If the Donatist bishops did not convene within the prescribed time, they would be declared defiant under a threefold summons. If they still refused to attend after being summoned, the people, realizing their teachers were defeated in silence, would abandon them and adhere to the true decrees of the Catholic faith. For this dispute, he appointed Flavius Marcellinus and Notarius to preside as judges, granting them full authority to convene, summon bishops, establish proceedings, and make decisions on the entire matter. Armed with this edict, Marcellinus issued a mandate informing all bishops throughout Africa, both Catholic and Donatist, to convene in Carthage within the legally prescribed time, that is, within 4 months ending on June 1. He instructed all magistrates throughout Africa to notify the bishops and ensure they arrived in Carthage within the specified 4 months. Furthermore, to encourage the Donatists to participate more readily in the conference, he ordered that churches and places previously held by them be restored to those who agreed to attend. He added that if the Donatists were suspicious of him, he would not object to having another judge of equal or higher rank and faith, chosen by the Donatists themselves, to sit with him. Finally, he declared that regardless of whether the decision favored the Donatists or the Catholics, the Donatist bishops would not face any harassment and could return to their homes freely and unharmed. The bishops sent orders to their colleagues who were to attend the meeting. Following these orders, the Donatist bishops gathered in Carthage from all over Africa. On May 18, they informed Marcellinus by letter that they had arrived in the city to commence the meeting. The Catholic bishops, upon their arrival, also sent a letter to Marcellinus, expressing their satisfaction with the meeting. They agreed that those chosen to present their case should fulfill their duty, sign the proceedings, and argue on behalf of everyone. They offered this condition, with the unanimous consent of all the bishops, to the Donatists: if the opponents could prove that the church had perished and remained only within the party of Donatus, they would not hold any episcopal office or honor among them. But if, on the contrary, the Donatists were defeated and wished to return to unity, they agreed that the Donatists would not lose the honor of the episcopate. Thus, where there were 2 bishops, the Catholic bishop, joined in honor by his counterpart, would sit together, both holding prominent positions, just like a visiting bishop next to his colleague, each taking the first place in honor in different churches. Upon the death of one of them, the other would individually succeed as before. Or if the Christian community preferred individual bishops and could not tolerate having 2, both the Catholics and the Donatists would step aside. The churches, with the cause of schism condemned, would be established in peaceful unity by those found in each church, and new bishops would be appointed in each place. Records of the meeting show that on June 1, 411, in the Secretarium of the Praetorium of the Gargilian Baths in Carthage, the bishops of both parties convened. After reading the emperor's edict, Marcellinus' order, and the letters from both Catholic and Donatist bishops, they chose Marcellinus as the sole judge. 21 Donatists were selected, but they disputed the time that had passed. All the present bishops who had subscribed to the orders were reviewed, revealing 286 Catholics and 279 Donatists. 7 representatives from each side were chosen to argue the case on behalf of everyone. Their statements were recorded and reviewed by notaries from both sides, and the proceedings were completed by the office. The hearing was then postponed to June 3. On June 3, the chosen representatives, their advisors, and 4 record-keepers, along with the notaries, gathered at the meeting place. Since the proceedings had not yet been written down, a brief dispute ensued, leading to a delay until June 8. On June 8, the case was argued with great passion, and loud voices were heard from both parties. It's unnecessary to detail what was said, as it can be found in the meeting proceedings and St. Augustine's summary at the end of this work. For now, I'll only mention that after a fierce and prolonged discussion, the judge ruled in favor of the Catholics against the Donatists, and prohibited new Donatist meetings. He ordered that the churches, previously returned to the Donatists by a fiduciary decree, be handed over to the Catholics. However, he allowed the Donatist bishops to return home, giving them the choice to either join the one true church or comply with the laws. Finally, he decreed that the places where circumcellions gathered should be seized by the treasury. Augustine wrote a summary of this meeting, and afterward, he wrote a book to the Donatists, urging them not to be further deceived by their bishops. The law of Honorius, following the conference, targeted the Donatists. When the emperor received a report detailing the events and the judge's decision, he issued a law on January 30th of the following year. This law imposed various financial penalties on the Donatists, based on their status, if they refused to join the Catholic Church. It also ordered that their bishops and clerics be expelled from Africa and sent into exile, and that whatever had been granted to their churches be handed over to the Catholic churches. The Donatists' fury was ignited. Due to this law, many Donatists were corrected and returned to the Catholic Church. However, some became more aggravated and irrational than before. In the Diocese of Hippo, they ambushed and killed the Catholic priest Restitutus, and also kidnapped the priest Innocentius from his home, gouged out his eye, and cut off his finger. Marcellinus, the tribune, who was responsible for executing this matter, conducted a moderate investigation into the suspects. He did not use tearing nails or burning flames, but extracted confessions of crimes with the use of whips. The severity of the laws demanded that the guilty suffer the same as they had inflicted. However, Augustine, who opposed any cruel and especially capital punishments, wrote to Marcellinus, the proconsul Donatiu, and Aprinius, urgently requesting that the death penalty and mutilation of limbs be remitted. He asked Marcellinus to make public the records proving the Donatists' crimes, and present them to the people, so that shame and dishonor would deter others from committing such crimes. Other bishops also interceded with the judges on behalf of the accused to prevent them from facing the death penalty. Despite this clemency from the Catholics, it could not quell the Donatists' fury. Augustine recounts that Macrobius, one of their bishops, went around accompanied by bands of depraved men and women, forcibly opening basilicas for himself. The accusations of the Donatists against Marcellinus. To discredit the judgment passed against them by Marcellinus, the Donatists claimed he had been bribed by the Catholics with whom he shared communion. They argued that his ruling was biased and given at night, which they deemed improper. They also asserted that Marcellinus had not allowed them to present all their evidence, and complained about being forcibly confined in the secretarium of the Gargilian baths during the conference. The Catholics rightly laughed at these claims. They pointed out that the allegation of bribery lacked any evidence or witnesses. If the Donatists had concerns about Marcellinus, they should have raised them before the dispute began. Not only did they fail to do this, but when given the chance to choose another judge to sit with him, they declined, and even praised him multiple times. During the proceedings, each participant was given a water clock and the freedom to speak as much as they wanted. Regarding the complaint about being confined in the Gargilian baths, the Donatists had no more reason to complain than the Catholics, as both parties were present there. How could the place be considered a prison when the judge was also present, and they were free to leave whenever they wished? The issue of the judgment being passed at night was a trivial complaint from the forensic lawyer Petilianus. There is nothing preventing a judge from sitting longer if the case requires it. Nonetheless, the audacity and insolence of the Donatists' accusations grew so much that the African Fathers convened to address the issue at the Synod of Cirta, or Zerta, held the year after the conference. In the name of this synod, Augustine wrote a letter to the Donatists, formerly numbered 152 and now 141, in which he refuted these slanders. The letter was dated June 14. The death of Marcellinus. Confirmation of the sentence of Marcellinus. But the Donatists, not content with tarnishing Marcellinus' honor with their slanders, also sought his life. They managed to have him beheaded on September 13, 413, by order of Count Marinus, who had defeated Heraclian in Africa, under the pretext that he was a member of Heraclian's faction and oppressed by tyranny, though he was innocent. From this, they began to claim that the judgment passed by Marcellinus was invalid. When Emperor Honorius understood this, he issued a very severe law against them on June 22, 414, and another law on August 30, 415, affirming that what Marcellinus, whom he called a man of honorable memory, had done against the Donatists and had transferred to public records, was to have perpetual validity. The Donatists' persistent appeals to Count Boniface did not fare any better, as he rejected the slanders of the most deceitful men, and preferred Augustine's counsel laid out in that remarkable book or letter titled On the Correction of the Donatists. The actions of Augustine with Emeritus. In the year 418, on May 1, the Fathers of the Universal Council of Carthage issued decrees to extinguish the remnants of the Donatist sect. In the next September, while Augustine was at Julia Caesarea with some colleagues, he happened to meet Emeritus, the bishop of that city and a partisan of Donatus, who had been one of the participants in the conference. He brought him to the church and wanted to argue with him, but Emeritus did not dare to mutter or even open his mouth, and patiently listened to Augustine's speech against his followers. Augustine had written a book against this Emeritus shortly before, titled To Emeritus, Donatist Bishop, after the conference, which briefly summarized the matters by which they were defeated or shown to be defeated. This book has been lost, but his book on the actions with Emeritus and the speech delivered in the presence of the people of the Church of Caesarea still exist. Council of the Donatists. Around the same time, a Donatist convention was held, attended by Petilianus and more than 30 other bishops. In that meeting, they devised a plan to counter the oppressive edicts. They chose to endure their old sufferings, hoping to be recognized as martyrs among their people, rather than be deported to the islands. They also decided that those who had communicated with Catholics, as long as the bishops or priests had not offered sacrifice or preached to the people, should be forgiven and restored to their honors. This decision weakened the Donatist schism. Meanwhile, Dulcitius, the tribune and notary of the imperial commands, was strictly enforcing the penalties prescribed by the laws against the Donatists in Africa. He declared the Donatists to be without legal standing, imposed fines, reassigned their basilicas and properties to the Catholic Church, and exiled bishops and clerics to distant islands and provinces. Due to his vigilance, many returned to the Church, and the Donatist sect, which had previously flourished in Africa, was significantly weakened. However, some remained stubborn in their defiance. Some refused to surrender their basilicas to the Catholics, while others took their own lives in various ways to be regarded as martyrs. Some attacked Catholics, killing many, while Catholic leaders diligently tried to protect Donatists from the death penalty. Regarding Gaudentius of Thamagati, a leader and instigator of these evils, he was one of the 7 Donatist leaders at the conference. Dulcitius sent him a letter, urging him to join the Catholic unity and discouraging him from the fire he threatened to use to consume himself, his followers, and the Church. He added that if they considered themselves righteous, they should flee according to the command of the Lord Christ rather than burn themselves in wicked fires. Gaudentius responded with 2 letters, one shorter due to the haste of the messenger, and the other longer, supposedly providing a fuller and more careful reply. Dulcitius believed both of Gaudentius's letters should be sent to him for refutation. At the same time, he sought Augustine's advice through letters on how to respond to these heretics. Augustine refuted both of Gaudentius's letters in a single book. When Gaudentius received it, he replied as he saw fit, but Augustine dismissed his response, deeming it unworthy of a rebuttal. However, in response to Dulcitius's request, Augustine stated that the madness of those people should not prevent him from striving for unity and enforcing the emperor's laws. Law of Theodosius the Younger against the Donatists. The same laws were renewed by Theodosius the Younger with a law issued on May 30, 428, but shortly after, the Donatist sect was shielded from the emperor's laws due to the Vandals' invasion. Some who pretended not to be enemies of the Arians also seem to have been supported by the Vandals. Nevertheless, most of them and the Catholics suffered the same fate, and lived miserable lives under the Arian yoke. Indeed, the Arian bishop Fastidiosus, whose words are reported by Fulgentius, persecuted both the Donatists and the Catholics. Remnants of the Donatists until the 6th century. However, the remnants of this schism, though weakened and diminished, survived for a very long time in Africa, as is evident from the letters of Gregory the Great to the Africans. From these letters, we learn that there were still many Donatists in Africa at that time. Although restrained by the exarch Gennadius, their numbers grew, with many being brought into their sect and rebaptized. Some Catholic bishops were driven out of their churches by them. To address this issue, Gregory ordered a synod to be convened, which was held by Dominicus, the bishop of Carthage, who took every care to purge the African church of this stain. Rescripts were sent against them at that time by Emperor Maurice, but the African bishops complained that they were not being enforced. Gregory informed the emperor of this matter by sending letters from the Africans and requested that severe measures be taken against them. He wrote to the African bishops, stating that the Donatist bishops who returned to the church should be welcomed, but with the condition that they could not aspire to the highest office. For over 300 years, the schism persisted in Africa, having begun at an unfortunate time and with a bad omen. During Constantine's reign, it could not be extinguished by either ecclesiastical or civil judgments. Under Emperor Constans, it was temporarily suppressed but flared up again under Julian, and for many years it affected a large part of Africa. Eventually, through writings, debates, and imperial laws, it was diminished and reduced to a few, whose unfortunate heirs lingered in some corners of Africa until the 6th or 7th century.